give away the blueprints for such a device to one of their main adversaries. When he looked at the plans, he could tell right away that the plans were fake and that the device wouldn't work. When he told the CIA handler that the blueprints were flawed and that Iranian engineers would pick up on it almost immediately and as quickly as he had, his handler told him everything had been accounted for and to simply go ahead with the operation. Unconvinced, but not willing to disobey direct orders, the Russian scientists traveled to a scientific conference in Vienna where Iranian nuclear scientists would also be in attendance. Worried that the blueprints were so obviously flawed that his cover would be blown as soon as he handed the plans over to the Iranian scientists, the Russians slipped a note into the envelope, warning them that the blueprints were imperfect, but that he could fix them if they wanted. The Iranians would get the fake plans that the CIA wanted delivered, and his cover story of a greedy yet unemployed Russian scientist looking for the highest bidder would still be intact. The plan worked, sort of. The Russian delivered the envelope to the Iranian delegation, and the National Security Agency reported just days later that one of the Iranian officials had changed his entire schedule and booked an immediate flight back to Tehran. Seemed like the Iranians had taken the bait. But in the coming years, there were no reports of Iran's nuclear program rushing to build the design, only to fizzle out during testing. What the CIA had apparently failed to account for was that Iran already had a large body of knowledge thanks to the information fed to them from Pakistani nuclear scientists years earlier, along with their own work. The CIA had underestimated the talent of Iran's nuclear engineers, and the whole plan may have backfired, actually advancing Iran's nuclear program instead of derailing it. Under this theory, Iran's engineers quickly identified the flaw in the plans even without the Russian scientist's letter, then compared the blueprints to similar designs they already knew would work, filling in gaps in their knowledge without having to go through lengthy prototyping and testing phases. Exactly what happened once the plan made it to Tehran still hasn't been declassified, but the whole debacle was such a scandal within the CIA that former CIA officer Jeffrey Sterling went public with the details, speaking to both the Senate Intelligence Committee as a whistleblower and to the New York Times reporter James Risen as an anonymous source. But Sterling's communication with Risen were intercepted by the federal government, and the former CIA officer was arrested on January 6, 2011, and charged with mishandling classified information under the Espionage Act. Operating far behind enemy lines in their mountainous north, a joint force of CIA paramilitary officers, special forces, and thousands of Kurdish fighters quietly laid the groundwork for one of the most strategic and overlooked campaigns of the war. The Kurds, which is an ethnic group spread across Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey, have long dreamed of an independent homeland, but their struggle has often been met with brutal repression. Under Saddam Hussein, this meant chemical warfare, where they were gassed, and in 1988, they killed 5,000 of them. These guys obviously hated Saddam and were eager to help the United States overthrow Saddam's dictatorship in 2003. Turkey, a NATO member and a key staging ally in the Middle East, even characterizes this group as terrorists. So any US involvement with the Peshmerga had to be kept under wraps until at least the situation in Iraq was under control. In the weeks leading up to the launch of the Operation Iraqi Freedom, small teams of CIA paramilitary officers, along with special forces, inserted into northern Iraq and linked up with the Kurdish fighters there. The CIA and SF teams gathered intel for the coming ground operation, and they had trained with the Kurds. Despite their common enemy, the Kurdish forces were split by a bitter rivalry between the KDP and the PUK factions. This meant that the CIA officers not only had to survive for months behind enemy lines, but also act as a kind of mediator between the Pentagon, the rival Kurdish factions, all at once. They were the world's most deadly peer mediators ever. They moved unseen through the rugged terrain of northern Iraq, assessing the enemy forces and paving the way for Task Force Viking, which was the responsible force for invading from the north. Their job was to prevent Iraqi forces from reinforcing Baghdad or joining the main fight to the south. When the invasion kicked off, the Iraqi army had no idea there were already covert American troops in their midst. They struck the Iraqi units without warning from multiple directions as soon as the invasion kicked off in 2003. This left them vulnerable when the rest of Task Force Viking swept through the country. But the job wasn't easy. During the Battle of Debreka Pass, the US and the Peshmerga forces met stiff resistance from the Iraqi defenders that counterattacked with tanks and mechanized troops. They deployed T-55s and anti-aircraft guns that were more than capable of shredding infantry in the open. The American operators were without armor, so the US Peshmerga contingent had to work together to defeat the Iraqi counterattack. The Peshmerga assaulted Iraqi bunkers and mortar positions, while the US soldiers fired javelin-guided missiles and called in precision airstrikes. But the first airstrike missed and hit friendly forces. The 1,000-pound GBU-16 almost ended the battle right there. It killed 18 Peshmerga fighters and wounded another 45, along with 4 US Green Berets. The other Special Forces teams broke off from their advance and pushed to the scene of the friendly fire incident to provide medical aid to the wounded, both American and Kurdish alike. One of the Iraqi T-55 tanks tried to press the advantage and drove forward amidst the chaos, but it caught a javelin missile straight to the teeth from one of the Green Berets covering the area. 2 F-18s arrived on scene to finish off the remaining Iraqi tanks with bombing runs. The enemy forces were suppressed, and the Americans and the Kurds pushed forward together, securing the crossroads against all odds. While the Green Berets and Peshmerga did most of the fighting, sources say there were at least 2 military intelligence operators present during the battle. The world of US Black Ops in the Middle East is a shadow realm, filled with guys who don't technically exist, working in units that aren't on paper. These operations weren't just battles, they were experiments in a new kind of warfare that blurred the line between tinker, sailor, soldier, spy, and contractor. But now, after trillions of dollars, tens of thousands of lives, and an entire region reshaped, the question isn't just what happened in the shadows, but why did that just happen? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Go to www.cappyarmy.com for full show notes and sources and links to exclusive editions.
They are an organisation that's gone by many names, but one stands out above all the rest. Ask them today, and they'd call themselves Constellus Holdings, one of a patchwork of acquisitions alongside fast food chains, dot-com giants, and global retailers, all happily nestled under the publicly traded corporate umbrella of Apollo Global Management. Asked them a little more than a decade ago, after the departure of controversial CEO Eric Prince, and they'd call themselves Academy, a critical partner to the United States during its long-running war on terror. But ask them at the height of America's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they would have called themselves by a name far more recognizable, and one that cuts to the heart of both their organization's reputation and its operational history around the world. That name is Blackwater. But asking what this organization calls itself and asking what the organization actually is are two fundamentally different questions, and what this organization is, no matter what you call it, is a mercenary company. In fact, during its years in operation, the organization formerly known as Blackwater has been America's premier private military contractor, or PMC, a position that earns the organization everything from acclaim by the United States government to condemnation as instruments of American violent interventionism around the world. So today on Warographics, we're going to take a closer look at Constellus Holdings and its complicated and often dark past as Blackwater, as well as its convoluted evolution in the years since, and the role that it still plays today all across the world. Blackwater organization was founded in 1997 under the name Blackwater Worldwide, in a move that was, at the time, hardly a blip on the radar of the American defense industrial complex. It was the brainchild of two veterans and former Navy SEALs, Eric Prince and Al Clark, each of whom had an intimate knowledge of the American military's capabilities as well as the gaps in its architecture. Prince had spent 2 years as an officer with the SEALs, deploying to Haiti, the Balkans, and other hot zones around the world. By his own accounts, that experience, plus an acute awareness of the Rwandan genocide of 1994, showed Prince that the United States needed private military training capabilities to prepare potential special operators for service. In 1995, Prince quit the SEALs after the death of his father, and after selling his family's auto parts company in $1 billion deal, he used much of that newly found wealth to personally finance his new company. His partner, Al Clark, had spent a decade with the SEALs and had even served as a firearms instructor, but had grown frustrated at the Navy's lack of firing ranges and independently come to the conclusion that the military would benefit from what he called one-stop shopping for their training capabilities. Together, Clark and Prince created their organization with the goal, as Prince has since explained it, to provide training support and infrastructure to support military and law enforcement professionals in their current positions. Instead of raising a private army, the goal was to support the military America already had, or as Prince stated, quoting him here, do for the national security apparatus what FedEx did for the Postal Service. In Prince's view, that appeared to mean taking an unwieldy and rather blighted state organization and augmenting it with a private partner. To that end, the two purchased about 7,000 acres of land on the border between the US states of North Carolina and Virginia, known as the Great Dismal Swamp. According to most accounts, the organization drew its name from the black, putrid water of the marshes that surrounded that original base of operations. Less frequently, it's attributed to the Navy SEAL Code for Black Ops, that is to say covert or clandestine operations that are meant to be kept secret and meant to happen in a way that can't be tied back to the people responsible. Their logo, a 5-clawed bear paw in the crosshairs of a scope, was done as a reference to the bears that roamed the property. On that land, they built a massive training center featuring several indoor and outdoor shooting ranges, simulated reproductions of urban environments, a driving track, and an artificial lake alongside other amenities. According to the company itself, it's the largest combat training facility in America, while the Center for Land Use Interpretations describes it as, quote, one of the largest and most sophisticated private security training sites in the country. There, Blackwater had the capacity to train their clients on everything from marksmanship to tactical driving to convoy protection to maritime security operations to urban peacekeeping and combat tactics. They'd welcome trainees sent from the SEALs and other American special operations groups alongside people sent courtesy of SWAT teams to expand their capabilities, and for a while, they were pretty successful. Said one local writer, Jay Price, then working for the nearby city of Raleigh's The News and Observer, to the degree that Prince was thought of, it was as this patriotic guy who had built this Hail Mary facility to help the SEALs and probably hope to break even. The big contracts weren't on the horizon, not even a glimmer. Blackwater had found their niche. Their clients responded well to the services they offered, and they even managed to secure a US contract in the year 2000. At that time, Al-Qaeda had just bombed the USS Cole in the port city of Aden, and Blackwater got the call to send trainers to Yemen in order to provide Navy sailors with counterterrorism training. But then, everything changed for Blackwater, just as it changed for the rest of the world. Like many other companies throughout modern history, Blackwater is an organization that happened to be in the right place at the right time to fill a need that the world didn't know about until catastrophe struck. In this case, of course, that catastrophe was the terror attacks of September the 11th, 2001, in which Al-Qaeda successfully targeted the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. Once it became clear that the event was a massive, organized act of aggression against the United States, the American military kicked into gear. But in a practical sense, the need for major, unplanned military response meant that the United States had no time or advance notice to shift onto a war footing. America needed to fill the gaps quickly, and Blackwater is going to figure massively into their solution. Blackwater's first contract as part of the War on Terror came in early 2002 when high-ranking CIA officials solicited the company's services for a protection job. The CIA was looking for 20 men, all with top-secret security clearances and the ability to travel to Kabul, Afghanistan, who could protect the CIA's headquarters in the country and keep an eye on a second, more remote military base. At that time, American intervention in Afghanistan was still in its early stages, with active CIA operators being the primary forces on the ground who were hunting for Osama bin Laden. But then, as now, the American roster of top-level operators isn't a particularly long list, and Blackwater's connections with experienced and highly trained operators like the Navy SEALs meant that they were an ideal way to outsource some of the lower priority needs of the agency. Put Eric Prince's guys on guard duty, and America's Black Ops best and brightest could do more with their limited numbers. For an initial 6-month contract, in exchange for over $5 million, Prince personally led his team to Afghanistan. By all accounts, the mission was a success. That first contract in Afghanistan was an eye-opening one for Blackwater, and particularly for Eric Prince himself. The cost-effectiveness with which Blackwater had provided security, as Prince would later explain it, had been good for everybody. The individual men on the mission had made some very impressive earnings, with daily wages equivalent to nearly $1,000 in today's money, but for the United States, the price of their services wouldn't have even made for a noticeable rounding error in the budget. In the coming months, Blackwater began hiring and restructuring itself to provide private security to the United States at a much larger scale, all the while picking up more individual contracts for which the organization rarely suffered competitors. And then Blackwater was in the right place at the right time on a second consecutive occasion. This go-around, they'd optimized their services just in time for the United States to decide to launch a full-scale invasion of Iraq on faulty intelligence that indicated the presence of weapons of mass destruction. Militarily, the invasion was not a difficult one for the US. During a surprise operation beginning on the 20th of March 2003 with no declaration of war, an American-led coalition stormed into Iraq and captured Baghdad within 3 weeks. By April the 15th, the military offensive was all but wrapped up, and a couple of weeks later, US President George W. Bush declared mission accomplished. Of course, anybody with even the most cursory awareness of how the Iraq War went knows that the mission was, in fact, not accomplished, and before long, America was dealing with a full-blown insurgency. That was going to be a particularly massive problem, because now the US had pivoted toward the long, hard slog of rebuilding. American diplomats, intelligence officers, humanitarians, and more were all pouring into Iraq just as the American was realizing that much of the Iraqi population really didn't want them there. To address that problem, Blackwater conferred 3 particularly helpful advantages to the US government when compared to the prospect of using its own troops for protection duties. First, it allowed the US to save their well-trained personnel for other more important and high-risk missions where their manpower was badly needed. Second, it provided a means to put more boots on the ground in Iraq and for more dangerous purposes without the US military having to actively send the American taxpayers' sons and daughters into particularly dangerous assignments. And third, it meant that if an operation went sideways, whether by killing Blackwater contractors, leading to the deaths of American VIPs, or even the personnel acting on some not so acceptable animosity toward local Iraqis, then it would be Blackwater, and not America itself, who would take the blame. Blackwater made its entrance to Iraq in the fall of 2003, when it was awarded a nearly $28 million contract to protect one Paul Brennan. longtime member of the US Foreign Service who'd cut his teeth as a prominent wingman to Henry Kissinger, Bremer had been appointed as the leader of the Coalition Provisional Authority, the organization that the US had set up to basically run Iraq for a while. In that post, Bremer had the authority to rule by decree, exercise control over an Iraqi interim governing council, and to write whatever conditions he wanted into the new Iraqi constitution. All of that meant that Bremer had a massive target on his back now that there was a full-blown insurgency running amok through the country. Blackwater were the ones providing a large security detachment around Bremer, relying on multiple helicopters and a highly visible contingent of very well-armed, very scary-looking American gunmen to deter any attempts on Bremer's life. They would oversee Bremer's security up until the end of June 2004, when Bremer finished up his work and left Iraq in the hands of an interim government. Days later, Blackwater would receive its biggest military contract yet for nearly $500 million in exchange for offering protection for US State Department diplomats in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other nations. During those same years, Blackwater would be called upon to guard American military installations in Iraq and provide training for the new US-backed Iraqi security forces. Blackwater would start picking up duties organizing and protecting convoys, providing supplemental assistance to train Americans on the ground, and guarding a wide range of civilian VIPs. Even had the resources to start running aerial surveillance operations. During the American retreat, Blackwater would dispatch a contingent of several hundred employees to the American South, largely to guard the wealthier inhabitants of New Orleans from what was, at the time, portrayed as a lawless environment in the wake of the disaster. Wrote Jamie Wilson for The Guardian, quoting, "Hundreds of mercenaries descended on New Orleans to guard the property of the city's millionaires from looters. Heavily armed men employed by private military companies, including Blackwater and ISI, are part of the militarization of a city which had a reputation for being one of the most relaxed and easygoing in America." The quote ends. Blackwater would work alongside other American and Israeli mercenaries at that time, guarding points and properties of interest, while a smaller detachment from the group assisted directly in rescue efforts. But by the time Blackwater forces deployed to assist in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the organization had already been caught up in the first of many incidents that made command to haunt it. The first such incident was one that prompted outrage at the time, not against Blackwater contractors, but to avenge them. In an incident on March the 31st, 2004, a Blackwater convoy conducting a food delivery in the Iraqi city of Fallujah was attacked by insurgent forces. The 4 Blackwater contractors operating the convoy, Scott Halvenston, Jerry Zovko, Wesley Battleowner, and Mike Teague, were killed, and their corpses were beaten, desecrated, burned, dragged through city streets, and eventually hung on a bridge over the Euphrates River. The attack was a shock to the United States, one that the US military would ultimately avenge during the Second Battle of Fallujah, which, by the way, we published a separate episode on if you'd like to learn more about that. According to the families of the victims, after the fact, the Blackwater employees had been ill-prepared to lead the convoy that day. According to legal testimony from a former Navy SEAL who'd known one of the killed contractors, former SEAL Scott Halvenston, well, people receiving training through Blackwater were trained largely to operate armored vehicles, not the unarmored vehicles the contractors had been in Fallujah. They'd been promised semi-automatic rifles, belt-fed machine guns, and time to gather intelligence and repair their convoy routes in Iraq. But when they arrived, the weapons were nowhere to be found, and their manager pushed them to run their convoy routes without adequate preparation. Finally, the men on the convoy had expected to have 3 operators per vehicle. Instead, there were only 2, meaning that nobody had been watching the rear of each vehicle. A congressional investigation found in 2007 that Blackwater had sent the convoy into an insurgent stronghold unprepared, and was directly responsible for not only their violent deaths, but for creating the conditions in which not 1, but 2 battles for Fallujah became unavoidable, all the while insisting its contractors were trained and ready to work. Blackwater blasted the report after the fact, but by then Blackwater's track record was far worse than it had been at the time the 4 contractors were killed. It was about this time in Blackwater's history that what had at first been seen as relatively harmless corner cutting during a free-for-all stage of American private contracting started to become a pattern of questionable conduct inside Iraq. In early 2005, Blackwater contractors working to protect a State Department convoy fired 70 rounds of ammunition into a car that had been perceived as a threat after it had refused an initial order to stop. Blackwater would later be found not to have been justified in carrying out the shooting. Claims that the convoy had been fired upon were later dismissed when it was found that a Blackwater contractor helicopter had actually fired his own gun into his own vehicle accidentally. Months later, 6 Blackwater contractors were killed alongside 5 international contractors when their helicopter was shot down, marking the first instance that a civilian helicopter had been felled from the sky during the US-led intervention. In early 2006, a Blackwater sniper killed 3 Iraqi guards while shooting down from the roof of Iraq's Justice Ministry, an incident that Iraqi witnesses, including army commander and guards from the Justice Ministry, called unprovoked. The US State Department would find that the act, quote, fell with improved rules governing the use of force. That same year, Blackwater contractors would crash their SUV into a US Army Humvee, and rather than working with the soldiers on the scene, the contractors disarmed them and forced them to lay prone at gunpoint until the situation was resolved. Toward the end of that year, a Blackwater employee would shoot and kill a security guard working for the Iraqi vice president in an incident during which that employee was reported to have been drunk. All the while, the organization proved that it was too valuable to the United States for the US to risk severing ties. In 2006, Blackwater would secure an even larger contract than it had done before, landing a bid to provide security to the US Embassy in Iraq. At that time, Iraq hosted the largest American embassy in the world, making it a massive target for insurgents at a time that American reconstruction efforts were at high points and when anywhere from 20,000 to 100,000 military contractors were believed to be at work in the country, although no official figures have ever been established. At the embassy, and their other high-profile guard postings, Blackwater employees would frequently fire on the Iraqi population, including many instances in which Iraqi drivers at Blackwater checkpoints didn't comply quickly with Blackwater orders. Nonetheless, they were a cheaper option than American soldiers. They kept US manpower set aside for more important tasks, and they made sure that when incidents of violence occurred, the Americans behind the trigger were not technically US military personnel. And even worse was what came on September the 16th, 2007, in an incident that would later become known as the Nisour Square Massacre. On that day, a 19-man team of Blackwater contractors in a 4-truck convoy responded to an explosion of a car bomb at a site where US and Iraqi leaders were having a meeting. The Blackwater team was supposed to secure an evacuation route, but refusing orders, the team's leader decided instead to advance to a location called Nisour Square. There, as contractors locked down a traffic circle, the driver of a Kia car failed to stop when ordered and was shot once in the head by a Blackwater operator. The car continued to roll forward. The person in the passenger seat, who was the mother of the driver, was also shot and killed, and the car was eventually incinerated by a grenade. Although accounts of the incident vary sharply, according to Iraq versus the US State Department, 15 additional Iraqis were killed in the incident, with an FBI investigation after the fact establishing that a minimum of 14 of them had been shot without bullets. It was a catastrophic event, roundly condemned as a massacre carried out by US mercenaries, and it would eventually lead not just to retaliatory action against Blackwater, but to a series of decisions that would see the US pull up stakes in Iraq years later. 5 Blackwater contractors would be convicted of serious crimes, including first-degree murder for 1 and 14 counts of voluntary manslaughter by 3 others, although the 4 who faced the most serious charges would be granted full presidential pardons by Donald Trump in the year 2020. And even the Nisour Square Massacre wasn't the full extent of the abuses that Blackwater was accused of, even just in the year 2007 alone. Also in that year, Blackwater would be investigated for smuggling weapons into Iraq, with those weapons then alleged to have passed into the hands of a US-designated terrorist organization through the black market. They'd be accused of instigating a standoff in Baghdad between themselves and commandos from the Iraqi Interior Ministry, a group that was ostensibly on the same side of the war. They'd shoot a civilian who was said to have been, quote, driving too close to a State Department convoy. Then in August of that year, a manager from Blackwater named Dan Carroll, who was at the time the leader of Blackwater's Iraq deployment, threatened to kill a US State Department investigator who had been working on and eventually who produced a fierce condemnation of Blackwater's practices and lack of oversight. Wrote the investigator, quoting here, "The management structures in place to manage and monitor our contracts in Iraq have become subservient to the contractors themselves. Blackwater contractors saw themselves as above the law. The contractors, instead of department officials, are in command and control." The quote ends. In describing the incident in which the investigator was threatened, the report reads that Carroll stated, quote, that he could kill me at that very moment and no one could or would do anything about it as we were in Iraq. That report, by the way, was finalized just weeks before the Nassau Square massacre. Said strategist Peter Singer about these years for Blackwater, well after the fact, quoting, "The Blackwater State Department relationship gave new meaning to the word dysfunctional. It involved everything from catastrophic failures of supervision to shortchanging broader national security goals at the expense of short-term desires." Investigators would soon find the Blackwater employees have been improperly storing automatic weapons in the same rooms where they'd get drunk and party with female visitors, and often carried weapons for which they had no certification, training, or authorization. Wrote the New York Times, quoting, "The armored vehicles Blackwater used to protect American diplomats were poorly maintained and deteriorating, and the investigators found that 4 drunk guards had commandeered one heavily armored $180,000 vehicle to drive to a private party and crashed it into a concrete barrier." Blackwater was also overbilling the State Department by manipulating its personnel records, using guards assigned to the State Department contract for other work, and falsifying other staffing data on the contract, the investigators concluded. The quote ends. A firm affiliated to Blackwater enlisted many Pakistani and other foreign nationals to guard Blackwater's own compounds, but provided them only, quote, "squalid conditions, sometimes 3 to a cramped room with no bed," according to the report by the investigators. American journalist Jeremy Scarhill alleged that Blackwater operatives had worked alongside the CIA to perform snatch-and-grab operations in Pakistan, where Blackwater claimed only to have a single employee. In one other incident around this period, as reported by the New York Times, Eric Prince himself had demanded the Blackwater employees at the company headquarters in North Carolina swear an oath of allegiance to the PMC itself and sign and return a copy of the oath, which mirrored the oath that US military officials are supposed to take before beginning their service. Between mounting legal pressure, increased frustration from the US government, and a rising tide of disgust towards Blackwater on the American home front, Blackwater began to face real scrutiny for its actions abroad. Eric Prince would admit in testimony before Congress that Blackwater lacked legal mechanisms to deal with overreach or misconduct by their employees, although he refused to provide financial documentation on the PMC and would largely avoid questions about his own role in cultivating a permissive environment for the sorts of abuses that Blackwater was accused of. The US House of Representatives began to issue firmer regulations on Blackwater, and the State Department recommended in 2008 that Blackwater be dropped by the US government before announcing in 2009 that Blackwater would not see its contracts renewed the following year. In Iraq, the PNC would have its blanket immunity revoked by the Iraqi-led transitional government, and a barrage of legal action following the event would result in lawsuits against a long list of Blackwater employees. One American lawsuit, filed in Alexandria, Virginia, would allege that Blackwater employees murdered a fellow Blackwater staff member who intended to testify against the PNC, encouraged the murder of Iraqi civilians, laundered money, smuggled weapons, and engaged in child prostitution, while another, filed by an American legal advocacy non-profit, directly accused Blackwater of engaging in war crimes. But even that withering legal onslaught would only bring Blackwater down in name. Beginning in 2007, Blackwater had worked to change its image, replacing its logo with a less threatening emblem and stating publicly that it would start to move away from security contracting. In 2009, the company changed its name to XC Services LLC and announced that it was restructuring its company, with the goal being to move away from security operations for the most part and begin providing a broader range of services to its global clients. Most important of all, Eric Prince resigned, leaving his post as CEO while maintaining his chairmanship of the company board. Prince made no secret of his displeasure at stepping down, emphasizing that after what he claimed was 35,000 personal security missions to protect Blackwater clients, quote, "No one under our care was ever killed or seriously injured." A new roster of friendly-looking faces was appointed in his stead, people with far less of a tendency to cause PR nightmares, and when it came to their legal troubles, the company largely buckled down and shut up, doing the long, hard legal slog required to dig themselves out from a quagmire that only seemed to get worse from month to month. But By 2010, the worst of the legal trouble was already out in the open, and Blackwater, now XE Services, had done enough work on their optics and their public relations that the crisis seemed somewhat navigable. Perhaps it was an effort for the State Department and the American military to save face. Perhaps it was a lack of will to prosecute XE Services for Blackwater's overreach, or perhaps it was because the government felt that the punishment XE Services was already weathering was enough. Regardless of the precise reason, though, XE Services would not be shut down, and the bulk of their employees under Blackwater would either remain on staff or leave of their own volition. Partway through 2010, XE Services went through another change, being purchased by a group of investors called USTC Holdings, and Eric Prince fully left his leadership position in the company. A new board was assembled, including reputable figures from the US, like former Attorney General John Ashcroft, former Vice Presidential Chief of Staff Jack Quinn, and former Director of the National Security Agency Bobby Ray Inman. A new team was put atop the organization's operational structure, and by 2011, the transformation was complete. Blackwater's newest new name would be Academy, and with the pain and hardship of Iraq now a relic of the past, the organization set out toward the future. By the time that the American federal government transitions into its second term under President Barack Obama, the organization formerly known as Blackwater is a very different organization from what it had once been. No longer was it a somewhat haphazard mix of elite former special operators and relative amateurs looking to take advantage of a lucrative opportunity. Now the organization was large and well developed, with a new compound in Illinois, a much more robust training program to their name, and a well-developed menu of services that included everything from intelligence work to protection operations to large-scale training to maritime security to consulting. Meanwhile, employees who hadn't proven trustworthy during the Blackwater days had been cut loose. The organization completed a merger with the PNC, an organization previously known as Triple Canopy that featured a much cleaner track record and a much stronger code of conduct than Blackwater of old. Finally, they passed into the hands of the company's current owners, Apollo Global Management. That company is an American asset management firm that does a little bit of everything. Also among their past and present holdings are the photography company Shutterfly, the video streaming and rental service Redbox, the Mexican-style fast food chain Qdoba, the for-profit University of Phoenix, and Yahoo Incorporated. Under Apollo, the newly merged PMC would be granted what is, at the time of writing, still its current name, Constellus. It's a profoundly different experience to describe the Constellus of today rather than the Blackwater Corporation of 2 decades ago. A quick visit to the Constellus website tells of revenues far past the $1 billion mark in 2023 and operations ongoing in over 50 countries with duties shared between a workforce of 14,000 strong. It's so called a handful of other private military organizations, and they proudly offer services as wide-ranging as executive protection, disaster relief, canine training, and even nuclear security. They provide ships to practice boarding and defense, airfields and drop zones for parajumping, racetracks for tactical driving, and several ranges set aside specifically to blow things up. The company's exterior is smooth and corporate. Its management is beholden to shareholders and investors that have very little connection to the world of private military contractors, and Constellus has even flirted with bankruptcy in recent years due to a relatively low demand for their services, although the company has since made a financial recovery. That's not to say that Constellus has been without occasional controversy, or that it's been without fatalities among its operators. In 2015, several Colombian nationals employed by the company, then still called Academy, were killed in Yemen while under the command of an Australian operative working for the UAE. A year later, missile strikes in Yemen killed numerous employees of the company, most hailing from Sudan, but some from a range of other nations, including the US. Somewhat less common nowadays is for the quality of Constellus operators to be called into question because of the company's history. While the decision to solicit the services of Blackwater's descendant organization occasionally does raise eyebrows from country to country, the organization has been largely successful in making the overreaches and catastrophes of the past seem like a distant memory. Whatever Constellus is, or whatever it does around the world, it's gone to great lengths to ensure that the world understands that it is not Blackwater, and the grand initiative appears to have been successful.
It's 2018, and the blazing sun hangs low in the sky over the Syrian desert.
The location? The town of Kashan. Pre-war population 7,000 in the Deir ez-Zor Belt. Kashan is a town but the Civil War, and in 2018, that war still rages with fury unmatched anywhere else. To the north of Kashan, the Kurds, a Western-backed coalition of ethnic minorities backed up by the United States of America. To the south are the forces of the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, backed up by a feared, but back then obscure mercenary organization called the Wagner Group. Neither side understands fully what the night ahead will bring, but as sunset turns to twilight, and twilight is replaced by the cold and quiet of the desert night, all hell is about to break loose. The battle that ensues will go down as history, as the first time a military force of Americans and a military force of Russians had fought each other directly since the Cold War. In the aftermath, dozens will lay dead, perhaps even hundreds, in a shocking first taste of adventure that today we know all too well.
Ever find yourself itching for a game that's a bit more explosive, a little something to satisfy your inner history buff and your need for action-packed chaos? Well, that's where War Thunder comes in, and they're today's sponsor. So, what is War Thunder? Well, imagine taking command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 different nations, spanning almost 100 years of military history. We're talking everything from World War II era biplanes to modern-day fighter jets. And the best part? It's free to play on PC and consoles. My personal favourite feature is X-ray damage. I love it. Doesn't show you where the target is. It breaks down why the explode, engine go up in flames, but great realism. Plus, whether you're a casual gamer or a simulation nerd, War Thunder's got something for everyone. Arcade mode for quick action, simulator if you're looking for something a bit more hardcore. And best of all, you can play it for free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. Just make sure to use my link in the video description or the pinned comment below when you sign up. If you haven't created an account or played in 6 months, you get a massive bonus package. It includes vehicles, 50% experience and income booster, 2 advanced vehicles for rent, the decorator, 100,000 silver lines, and 7 days of premium time. It's a lot, and it's available. Sponsoring and back to This is the Battle of Kamiko. It's better known today as the Battle of Kashan. By 2018, the Syrian civil war had long since evolved from a nationwide revolt against a repressive regime to a melting pot of competing insurgencies, competing ideologies, and competing foreign powers trying to turn the situation to their favor. Foreign involvement really picked up in 2014, when the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, better known as ISIS, had rapidly swallowed the territory and made global headlines for its brutality. But although a United States-led Western coalition had arrived with the primary focus of combating ISIS while working with their local Kurdish allies, the reality hadn't been so simple. Russia was backing the ruling regime, ostensibly also to counter ISIS, but taking a broad approach and pushing any faction that stood against the Assads, while the United States Syrian troops in its crosshairs more than just a few times. By late 2017, the United States had shifted its focus away from counter-ISIS operations. The group was still a threat, but it had been pushed out of most of the territory it controlled and was now run with American and Kurdish forces poised to begin clean-up operations in the areas where ISIS still had presence. With jihadists routed, the US pivoted toward longer-term goals, and specifically the prospect of starting negotiations with the Assad regime toward an end to the conflict. In hopes that those negotiations would take place on favorable terms for the United States, American forces take a more active role in counting Iranian measures backed by Iran and promoting support to the Kurds, locking down their territory and protecting their newly autonomous zone in the northeast. Although the situation would change significantly within the following 2 years, America's intent at the time was to transform its military presence in Syria into an open-ended threat, with the expectation that they would stick around as long as was necessary for the Assad regime to agree to a peace. But on the regime side of the conflict, the Assad family and their political allies were far less in a position than the United States. Although they were far from establishing control over the whole of their country, something they still haven't actually achieved even today, they had neutralized or found stalemate against any threat large enough to challenge their rule in Damascus, and they had worked to a diplomatic position where Assad himself could be assured that Western attempts to effect regime change would never get worldwide support. Assad had powerful allies. Iran was 2 borders distant to the east, and Russia lending direct military support, not just through airstrikes and military advisors, but through a mercenary organization that would carry out Moscow's will to the letter. Now, at the time of writing, 2024, we're all too familiar with the company or known as the RS3. Over the past few years, they've enacted extensive violence on people in Ukraine. They've used thousands of convicted prisoners in expendable human wave attacks, and they've attempted and been thoroughly punished for a mutiny that risked bringing the Moscow to its knees. But back in those days, Wagner was a relatively new organization, born out of Russia's low-grade war with Ukraine in the eastern Donbass long before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. These were still the days when breathless expose reports in Western media on these mysterious Russian mercenaries with their family name were relegated to the back pages of news sites for the true nerds of global affairs. In Syria, we picked up valuable experience and taken hard losses fighting against the Islamic State and anybody else who was toward. By the end of 2017, the focus has shifted toward oil and gas assets in Syria, probably because of a suspected policy in Moscow that established that private companies that could seize oil wells, gas assets, or mines from the Islamic State would be entitled to the rights to extract those very assets. By then, a suspected 5,000 or more Wagner fighters were in Syria, working for both the Russian Ministry of Defense and powerful companies that promised them a share of the profits from oil fields they captured. Their ISIS unit, in particular, gained local notoriety, fighting alongside and incorporating Syrians to their ranks as they attempted to eviscerate the economic core of the short-lived caliphate. By February of 2018, Wagner and their Syrian allies were steamrolling ISIS forces across the countryside and coming right up the conflict lines with US-backed military. They were separated by the Euphrates River, with Syrian regime forces and Wagner forming a hammer against ISIS and driving them into the anvil that was autonomous Kurdistan on the opposite shore. Both sides had an understanding of the Russia were to keep to opposite sides of the river, along with the local forces that supported. Russia and Syria appeared intent on pushing that boundary, flying their planes over the conflict line, harassing American warplanes, and sometimes dropping bombs on places where closely allied forces and even American advisors were. It wasn't just simple bullying either. It appeared to be an attempt to find out whether America really believed its own assertions that it would defend British forces Kurdish forces have come into possession of some very lucrative bits of fields. Syria wanted them back. Wagner was offered a 25% share of the revenues for any fields they could secure. The Americans weren't giving their adversaries seizing targets past the Euphrates. In order to get them, Syria and Wagner would have to attack directly. And if their goal was to provoke and measure an American response, then attacking an easy target simply didn't make sense. They'd have to attack someplace where the Americans had a presence to see if they'd stand and fight or abandon their Kurdish allies once the situation became more difficult than they had signed up for. The ideal target was located just outside of Kashan, where the company Kinoko harvested natural gas from fuel and processing to refinery that had the capacity to churn through 400 tons of the stuff every day. It was among one of the most lucrative civil targets in all of Syria, and if the Americans weren't going to defend that, then they probably wouldn't defend anything. As the sun rose on the morning of February the 7th, the American forces in Kashan already knew that something was coming. They'd seen a troop build-up over the course of the prior week, and we in the public domain have learned after the fact that intercepted Wagner chatter suggested that an as-yet unclear attack was coming. Per unnamed US intelligence sources interviewed by the Washington Post, America had a pretty clear understanding that the goal was a lightning attack of some sort. But how that assault would work was significantly less clear. No way to find out until it began. Prior to the battle, the United States had a small but significant troops that there weren't numerous, but they were among the very best at America's disposal. A roughly 30-man contingent made up of operators from some of Uncle Sam's most elite forces. Within the refinery were members of the U.S. Army Rangers, the shock troop regiment that the United States uses when it's looking for shock and water areas and full frontal assaults. Members of the U.S. Army Special Forces, or Green Berets, experienced soldiers who carry out unconventional warfare operations, leading and training foreign insurgencies, carrying out direct raids and assaults in unexpected places, and operating far behind enemy lines. They were backed up by members of the Screaming Eagles, the 101st Airborne Division, an elite air assault division that's used to fighting well behind enemy lines with little to no support. Also among the operators in Kasham were members of the Delta Force, arguably the most capable known asset in the entire United States military, experts in carrying out the most dangerous and complex secret missions that the U.S. Department of Defense can cook up. Stationed in Kasham was at least one Air Force combat controller, elite fighters who can keep pace with Delta, the Rangers, and the Green Berets while directing air strikes. We know that combat controller was there, by the way, because even though their name has never been revealed, they'd be awarded their branch's highest honor, the Air Force Cross, for their actions during battle. Also in close proximity was a base belonging to the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, the Kurdish coalition that the US was so closely partnered with in the area. About 20 miles away, another small US force lay in wait, a so-called quick reaction force made up of untrained guys who were ready to offer support if needed. A Marine infantry platoon was also on hand in the event the battle spiraled out of control and lost long enough for the Marines to mobilize and join in on the fight. But the force they were facing down was a hell of a lot bigger and more threatening. Not far from the refinery, some 500 or so ground troops had massed in a formation comprised predominantly of Wagner Group mercenaries, but also including members of the Syrian Army's 4th Armored Division and 2 pro-government militias, the Bakir Brigade, hailing from the Syrian city of Aleppo, and the National Defense Forces, a part-time unit made up of volunteers from a range of Syrian cities and towns. Compared to both the troops at the Sham outpost and the quick reaction force nearby, the Wagner mercenaries and the Syrians outnumbered them by 4 to 1, and they had a hell of a lot more firepower on the ground. The Wagner-led force had a total of 27 vehicles at its disposal, including multiple Soviet-era T-72 main battle tanks, multiple T-55 tanks, and several armored personnel carriers. They had at least 6 artillery pieces, including howitzers and heavy artillery units, probably accompanied by a small arsenal of infantry mortars. There was at least 1 twin-barrel Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun taken by Wagner forces, modified so that it could shoot level with the ground and take out targets. The gun could fire up to 33 rounds per second. It's unclear whether Wagner forces had only one at their disposal. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon that day, the Wagner and Syrian forces began creeping toward Kasham. Like many Wagner and Russian forces in assaults past, this group claimed to the Americans that it was taking part in a training exercise, and nobody on the ground was fooled by that nonsense. Quoting a Green Beret who spoke to American outlet The War Horse in 2023, it was that Russian doctrine says that they're going to do these things that look like exercises, like into the point. The Americans and the Kurds near their position understood that these were no training exercises and that an attack was coming within hours. The only question was where and when. About 10 o'clock in the evening local time, not at the Konoko plants, but right at the American outpost itself, the United States got its answer. The Battle of Kasham began with an encirclement as the column of tanks and armored vehicles under Wagner's control broke out from cover behind a neighborhood and took positions around the outpost. For half an hour, the standard before all hell broke loose. The US outpost came under a barrage of tank, mortar, and artillery fire, and the American operators inside quickly took cover. Defensive positions where anti-tank missiles and machine guns had been US operators held their fire as their commanding officers tried to reach out and demand that they call off an attack. A lone MQ-9 Reaper drone in the skies above launched its Hellfire missiles, causing some damage, but not nearly enough to make the Russians back down. After that, the Americans on the ground fired warning shots, taking every last preventative measure to stave off the first direct ground battle between nuclear-armed America and nuclear-armed Russia in generations. The drone above kept on circling, beaming back video of the assault despite lacking any means to directly intervene. But as As the American operators on base were holding out, other US forces were surging into action. The Rapid Reaction Force of Green Berets nearby, as well as several Marines from the platoon they were stationed with, had already loaded their mine-resistant vehicles with the missile supplies and optical gear they'd need, and were now speeding at breakneck pace through a war zone to get there. They were followed by a handful of Kurdish fighters in unarmored trucks, but not nearly enough to make a difference. Driving without headlights and relying on thermal optics to dodge down power lines and craters, the reaction forces were going into a firefight where they'd be exposed and outmatched. As defense writer Alex Hollins put it in 2023 in an article, quoting him, "It's important to recognize that they knew full well that they could only offer bodies and ammunition. They didn't have nearly enough firepower to balance the scales of the fight, let alone tip them in their favor. Without additional support, they were willingly driving into an American bloodbath, intent on helping their brothers in arms, even if it came at the cost of their own lives." But they weren't alone. In the skies, the cavalry was already on the way, comprising a who's who of American air assets that had been dispatched from all across the Middle East. Among their number were F-22 stealth fighters, F-15 E-Strike Eagle planes for ground attack runs, heavy B-52 bombers, formidable Ghost Rider gunships, and helicopters, all equipped with the sorts of firepower that Wagner on the grounds just... At this point in the battle, Wagner and their Syrian allies still hadn't advanced to take the US outpost, kept at bay by the operators holding a perimeter. It's unclear whether the troops on the ground realized that an American air wing might be on the way to deal with them, but they had neither the preparation nor the military hardware to be able to defend against the overflights that were on the way. Perhaps back in Wagner's command center and far away at Kremlin, that was relevant. After all, these were mercenaries, not Russian troops, and Russia had little reason to care if they were wiped out. The goal wasn't simply to take the Konoko plant. The goal was to see how willing the Americans were to defend it, and these 500-odd fighters might have been seen inside the Russian Ministry of Defense as a blank canvas for the Americans to paint out a response protocol that the Russians could study. But whatever the reason, the assaulting force hadn't taken over when the warplanes arrived, and they had little means to fight back. The ground force of Green Berets and Marines arrived about 30 minutes after the Americans at the outpost and started firing back, and roughly an hour and a half after the confrontation began. When they got there, they were forced to wait, knowing all too well that the intense fire pouring in on the American outpost was too dangerous for even their armored trucks to pass through. Kurdish fighters who had joined them chose to turn back, following a decision by a leader who one member of the reaction force would describe Riley in later interviews as, quote, "smartest man on the battlefield." Pinned down, not far off from the thresholds where ammunition would become too scarce to answer fire directly, the 30-some American commandos at the outpost were weathering heavy artillery and tank fire. Mercifully, none had died or been wounded yet, but with time running out, they'd soon have to switch gears and make ready for the ground assaults they knew would come after their base had been adequately tenderized. Eventually, the response force worked out a way in, guided by infrared lasers with the help of the commandos in the compounds, and they, along with the few Kurdish fighters who'd chosen to stay, took up defensive space. Their armored trucks were lined up behind defensive berms, pointing machine gun turrets atop them toward the Russians, but that only drew the fire of the monstrous anti-aircraft gun stretching to the position of almost 3 dozen 23mm rounds. A couple of probing infantry attacks were beaten in back with inexperienced and reportedly undisciplined Wagner and Syrian troops chewed up by the fire coming back at them. But that sort of defense wouldn't hold in the event of an all-out assault that seemed sure to be coming next. A few minutes later, 10 Russian tanks began advancing together toward the outpost, likely signaling what would become the beginning of the end for the forces pinned down in their path. Then, the cavalry arrived, streaking in from overhead with afterburners roaring and onboard guns firing. The Air Force combat controller on the grounds had been hard at work, marking targets and relaying information on proximity, position, and other targeting details as their situation got worse. With the advancing tanks now less than 1,000 meters away, the accounts of the Americans' violence make it abundant. It's clear what happened next. A rescue at the last seconds. 4 Apache helicopters were the first to arrive, and knowing the stakes of the moment, the operators on the grounds began expending the last 50 caliber ammunition they had, illuminating the battlefield so the helicopter pilots could get a better shot. By the accounts of one operator after the fact, things might have gotten worse a few moments later. The operator, identified only as Andrew, attested that allies over the radio had advised their force of an incoming Russian bomber, but the bomber never arrived, perhaps owed to the very obvious fighters that could down and after stealth fighters accompanied fighters that Russian bomber wouldn't have seen on radar, but that they very easily could have worked out. And once the American airman showed up, the tide was turned in a way that the Wagnerites and the Syrians stood no chance of. Leaked Wagner audio artifact described the Apache attack. This is quoting here, "If merry-go-rounds with machine guns. If that was bad, then precision-guided air-to-ground missiles were worse. The rest was elementary. A bombing run from an American B-52 and crippling destructive fire from a Ghost Rider gunship circling overhead. Within 45 minutes, the arrival of the Apache helicopters, the battle was over. The attacking mercenaries and militia laid to waste. Those who survived were forced to flee, although they'd come back throughout the night, far less confrontational in their approach to collect their dead. By the time the sun finally rose again over the oil fields of Kashan, the Americans were first. As American forces took stock of their situation at the battle's end, they discovered what we, at least in the public domain, understand to be something of a miracle. Per official reports and witness accounts of the battle, not a single American on the ground was killed or even injured, despite what seems to have been an incredible expenditure of ordnance by the adversaries. One fighter from the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish coalition, had sustained minor injuries, and some of the Americans had taken the sort of damage that would leave them sore for a few days, but against all odds, that was the worst. All that, and it's even more impressive, because at least by American standards, the tank assault and possible bomber run that might have occurred if the US air power didn't show up would have probably killed everybody there. On the opposing side, Wagner and Syria Russia officially claims 80 to 100. The United States claims between 100 and 200, and intercepted audio from Wagner fighters who were present suggest losses potentially well north of that 200 estimate. The vehicles the Russians had brought with them suffered just as badly. Per a Wagner fighter, who can be overheard in leaked audio recorded after the fact, quote, "Out of all vehicles, only one tank survived and one BDRM. That's an armored vehicle. After the attack, all other BDRMs and tanks were destroyed in the first minutes of the fight right away." Going by American accounts, the first minutes of the fight that the Wagner commando referenced were most likely the first minutes after air support began showing up, since their arrival apparently took place only after Russian tanks began their final advance. Said the same Wagner mercenary, quote, "Well, to make it short, we've had our kicked." The lone surviving tank, by the way, would be destroyed a few days later. The immediate aftermath of the battle would grant the United States and the rest of the world a window into just what it meant to face Wagner troops in combat. Russia would hardly acknowledge the battle in the aftermath and made only minimal attempts to explain the deaths of Russians in the incident, all the while firmly denying that any members of the Russian armed forces had been involved. Even during the battle, Russia had given the United States no information about what was going on, had completely refused to help draw down the fight, and had refused to claim the Wagner fighters as a component of the Russian military. We now know, in hindsight, that that was precisely the point of Russia using Wagner at all, hiding their intentions behind a mercenary force whose actions and whose lives they didn't have to take responsibility for. Wagner has served similar roles all across Africa and the Middle East, not to mention Ukraine, and although they haven't suffered a similarly massive defeat outside of Ukraine until all the way in 2024, Russia's handling of casualty reports has been consistent no matter how many Wagnerites die. And by some accounts, Russia's abandonment of the Wagner contingent began well before the dust had even settled in Kashan. American sources have suggested that Russia's Ministry of Defense may have chosen to abort its support for the Wagner column midway through the battle, allegedly powering down the mobile surface-to-air missile system that was providing coverage from aerial attack. It's unclear why that would have happened, but if, indeed, Russia's intent all along has been to assess whether the US would defend the oil and gas infrastructure Russia wanted, then by that point in the battle, perhaps Moscow had its answer. Perhaps it was better in the minds of the Russian MOD to abandon the Wagner fighters and let American air power wipe out all traces of their misadventure. It was only after the air defense system was shut down that American aircraft had been cleared to come in, and once they did, the battle was all but decided. Again, we today have the benefit of hindsight, and we know that the idea of Wagner fighters being expendable to Russia is no surprise. But back then it was new and critical information for a world still trying to figure out who they were and what they did. If the Battle of Kashan had gone differently, if American troops had executed a tactical withdrawal and surrendered the Konoko gas fields to Syrian forces, then it likely would have been just the beginning. If the Americans would give up Kashan, then Russia would have every reason to assume that they'd give up all the other oil and gas fields that were less important than Kashan. After that might have come larger offensives into Kurdish territory and seizure of assets that would have handed major wealth back to the Syrian regime. Instead, Wagner forces tried the same thing in Diaz or a couple of weeks later, and this time, when US officials called Russia to explain how such a confrontation would go, Russia listened. Today, the Euphrates River still divides Syria between the Kurds and the regime, and all the natural resources behind the Euphrates are still firmly in Kurdish hands. American forces haven't gone toe-to-toe with Wagner in the same way since the Battle of Kashan, and nor have they had to face troops that Russia does lay claim to. Instead, those battles are decided mostly in Ukraine, at least for now. But as the United States and the nations of NATO make ready for a gruesome prospect, a possible all-out defense of the alliance's eastern flank, the Battle of Kashan provides the only basis we've got to map out what such a defense could one day become. And that's a wrap for today's video, but before you click away, don't forget to check out our fantastic sponsor, War Thunder. If you haven't created an account or played in 6 months, you'll get a massive bonus pack to kickstart your journey. It includes 3 premium vehicles, 50% experience, and income booster. It's a lot, and it's available for a limited time only. There is a link to them in the description below. Play for free, and thanks for watching. 2 years ago today, one of the most dangerous mercenary organizations in human history launched a march on Moscow. They were well armed, hell-bent on bringing their enemies to heel, and across the span of hours before their attack was aborted, they crashed through barriers, brought down helicopters, and threatened to bring Russia to her knees. They were known as PMC Wagner, a mercenary army that spent a decade in operation as the shadow hand of the Russian Federation. Ruthless, bloodthirsty, permitted to operate outside the international rulebook, and relied upon to do the dirty work that Moscow could not do in the open. The Wagner Group was an organization unlike any other on Earth. During the Ukraine war, they swelled in size, sending wave after wave of desperate prisoners into a meat grinder. Around the world, they pillaged, plundered, and curried favor with all manner of despot and dictator in order to advance the grand vision of one Vladimir Putin. And as suddenly as they burst into public awareness, they were destroyed. They destroyed themselves by mutiny, by a mysterious plane crash, and by absorption into the vast Russian military. It's been 2 years now since the Wagner Group launched and aborted its ill-fated mutiny, and where there was once only shadow and mystique, international fact-finders and researchers have finally been able to shine a light. We now know much more about the group's sordid history, its inner workings, its highest authorities, and of course, what happened to bring it down. So, in this post-mortem analysis, we're going to dive deep into what the Wagner Group really was and what it really did. And perhaps, even more important than that, we're going to talk about the parts of PMC Wagner that have lived on and what they're doing today and why, despite the formalities, it may be too early to call this episode a post-mortem at all. Back in May of 2022, We Here at Warfronts wrote and recorded an episode on a mysterious group of Russian mercenaries known collectively as Wagner. They operated in the shadows, killing and torturing across continents with apparent impunity, and at that time, it was as if the entire world was oblivious to their existence. At the time we wrote our episode, Wagner was just beginning to flex its muscles as part of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Within weeks of that split being completed, they would gain global notoriety by conscripting thousands of Russian prisoners and sending them directly to their doom in massive human wave assaults. But back then, we didn't know what the Wagner group would become. They seemed to have a global reach, they seemed to tremendously value their role in the shadows, and they killed journalists. Ultimately, we decided to not release that episode. Turn the clock forward to May of 20. Let's consider the
Hybrid warfare is upon us because Russian Shahed attack drones just penetrated deep into Polish territory, forcing NATO to scramble fighter jets in an attempt to shoot them down. What all this means, to put it into perspective, is this is the first time in history that NATO forces have directly engaged the Russian military, raising fears that the war could spill over. So is it finally time to sound the alarmist alarm, or is this all just one great big misunderstanding, guys? Poland's prime minister said this situation brings us closest we have ever been to open conflict since World War II, and that they're facing an enemy that doesn't hide its hostile intentions. Meanwhile, the Russian Defense Ministry hid their hostile intentions by denying any involvement, saying, quote, no targets on the territory of Poland were planned for destruction. Today, I want to know what's the evidence for whether or not this was really a deliberate drone attack. What was the Russian military's objectives here? How effective was NATO's response really? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Let's find out.
But before we get into that, this episode is sponsored by Jocko Fuel, because all energy is not created equal, and how you choose to power yourself is important. I mean, it's 2025, you guys. I think we've evolved past trashy garbage gas station energy drinks at this point. I don't have time for drinks that spike me with energy then crash me out. That's why I switched to Jocko Fuel, because Go is clean energy that's good for me. It's got 95 milligrams of caffeine, so it wakes me up for the day, while at the same time being balanced with L-theanine and a nootropic blend that keeps me focused but not cracked out. No sugar, no chemical aftertaste, just crisp, sustained energy that lets me push through long work days. And here's the thing, over 90% of energy drinks fail in their first year, because let's be honest, most of them suck and they don't do it daily. But Jocko Fuel has been going strong for over 8 years now, because there are tons of people who actually find it valuable and enjoy it, like myself, and I see you guys in the comment section saying how much you love it too. And you can't fake that. So if you're building something, a body, a career, a family, or business,
Hey Mushi,
go to
it's going all right, man. How are you?
and use my code CAPPY25 for 25% off your first order of Performance Fuel. The link's in the description and pinned comment below. Back to the episode.
What happened is 19 Russian drones entered Polish airspace from 11:30 p.m. on Tuesday night until 6:30 a.m. Wednesday, September 10th. Violating airspace is considered a big party foul in this region, so NATO scrambled assets from multiple different countries, including Polish F-16 fighters, Dutch F-35 stealth fighters, and German Patriot air defense batteries to intercept these drones. All these different countries' weaponry was coordinated with an Italian airborne...
Love to hear that. I'm good. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Which identified the location of these enemy targets, fed it to the fighter jets real time, who then shot down at least 4 of them.
How's your day been so far, brother?
Over 400 attack drones and some 40 missiles into western Ukraine.
Been chilling, been gaming.
And the reason
What's
NATO
up?
officials think this isn't true, that it's just an accident, is because of how many and how deep they penetrated into Polish territory. Look at the live conflict map behind me. It's never a good day when I say that. The map shows us the marked geolocations where Russian drones were recovered.
I don't know, what is it?
These drones headed to enter to that is the biggest piece of evidence that this was an intentional Russian drone incursion, because one senior military official said that these drones had the flight path on their way towards the city of Rzeszów, inside of Poland. Rzeszów is in eastern Poland,
Diabolical.
100 kilometers from Ukraine's border. It just so happens to be a key logistics hub for NATO weapons being sent to Ukraine. In fact, 80% of all foreign aid and weaponry
That's fucked.
transits through Poland. There are warehouses here to store the munitions. Could it be a coincidence that these drones were headed there? Who knows? Only the military gods, right? Russia's Shahed drones could destroy these shipments when they're at their most vulnerable, all tied up and locked down in the shipment. Robert Kagan, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, said, quote, the only surprising thing about
This is the level in between an Infernal and RS3 Cape. Hold on, I'll explain more soon. I gotta change some settings. I don't wanna get too distracted while I do it. Or else I might die. What the fuck? How did I do that? Okay. The game is being a little weird right now. Not the inputs I made, but that's alright. Let me change this to this. Alright, cool. So yeah, they have Fire Cape, then they have something called the Kiln Cape, and then they have something called the Zut Cape. The Zut Cape is like this game's Inferno, but not really.
the attack on Poland is that it didn't happen sooner. Since before World War I, it was understood that if one nation's government provided weapons and war material directly to another nation at war with a third nation, that legally made the donor a belligerent in the war and therefore subject to attack. And when intercepting drones,
all this extra work for some apples just to make a fucking pie. I want to freaking do great things to my body.
In fact, Polish authorities had to send out an alert to some 9 million residents in
Oh.
the eastern part of the country, telling them to shelter.
Put me on the stretcher.
It's not just about the
Like fucking
cost of
Stewie and
weapons,
Lois.
really. You got to consider the cost of scrambling jets. It's enormous. Take a look at these numbers that are publicly released by the Pentagon for the costs. It's millions of dollars each time these jets have to be on space overnight, not to mention the maintenance, wear and tear on all the airframes. Usually, air-to-air missiles, fighter jets cost millions of dollars. The military powers of NATO would not be able to routinely use F-35s to intercept these cheap drones each and every night. I remember when I was younger and totally broke, I took my wife out on our first date night. Spent a bunch of money, but after that we started dating regularly and I realized I couldn't sustain that. What I'm saying is using F-35s is a steak dinner. You can't do it every night, but very recently NATO allies have developed a new capability exactly meant for this kind of occasion. They likely launched their new advanced precision kill weapon system. These are relatively cheap. They're like $16,000 rockets that destroy attack drones at a fraction of the cost of other air-to-air missiles. The F-15, for instance, is capable of carrying 82 of these 70-kilowatt rockets that hit multiple drones, far more than
listen,
like 8 regular
do
air-to-air
not
missiles
burn the
that you
pie.
Those drones
Do not
only cost
burn
about
thy pie.
$40,000 for Russia
You burn
to
this
produce,
shit, I'm
and they're capable of carrying a hefty
crash
payload of
out.
like 40 kilograms to 90 pounds.
Okay,
It's
Daddy.
basically around the explosive punch of like an artillery shell. It can level a 4 out of 5 drones intercepted. Doesn't sound like an outstanding interception rate, but this is
Nice. You have the
anything
pie.
down midair with a multi-million-dollar
eat it.
munition from a warplane can
Fuck,
cause
that'd be
tremendous
painful.
risk to the people underneath. It's a real hazard. No one wants fragments from
too
these
bad
landing
fucking
on their
RS3 doesn't
hull
have
track.
its
It can be more
freaking-
safe to let the drone crash,
freaking left
especially
click
if it's
options.
unclear if it's armed, has a payload or not.
So
and
if
it
you eat
sounds
that
like
shit, you're
these
just
drones were
fucked.
unarmed, and we'll get more into that in a second.
So if you
Polish
left click it,
officials said that only the drones that posed a real threat
Left click
were
it,
ones that
left
were
click
shot
it.
down.
Don't give me a
Military analysts all
ticket.
across the board, though,
Left it.
unanimously warning that NATO's response has exposed a weakness to Russia when it comes to this type of warfare. NATO does not currently seem to have the most effective mobile and defense teams with 50 cal machine gun trucks. They don't deploy helicopters or UAV interceptor teams for this.
someone needs to get rid of their
The best
fucking
option
fat
currently that
ass
they seem to
unicorn.
have is expensive stealth fighter jets. Conrad, the director of Roshan Consulting, is a defense analyst that's an expert on
Big
Russia
unicorn?
and
Where?
Belarus. His analysis was that claims
Sitting
that
at wars,
some drones were
frickin'
deliberately
making noises
allowed
and shit.
through because they pose no threat should be regarded
I
as a
hate that
dangerous
shit. I
illusion.
hate when people
Evidence
just.
that the drones
Why? You
have
don't. There's no
authorities
point of
by
having that
surprise
pet
is
spawn,
the
and it's
fact
just
that
being annoying and
some
loud as
footage was
shit.
found as far
Like that
as
dragon. There was a
550
dragon
kilometers
at the
or
beginning of
40
Leagues.
God, I
Some
fucking-
people had, and that shit was just annoying as fucking all hell. It was just making.
Zed Cape is nice. Melee one makes overpower hit twice. Yeah, fucking need that Zed Cape. Kinda jealous of your Trigors. Don't worry, it's Leagues. They'll be gone.
It's only Leagues. We got. They're just gonna no longer be there.
Kagan said, quote, aiding Ukraine has already begun to be a controversial subject in Poland. The prospect of Russian attacks and retaliation could drive up opposition, especially if the United States proves unreliable, end quote. It can also be aimed at creating what
Man
is
said he's
essentially
jelly.
drama between the NATO allies.
Understandable.
It could force there to be
Dyes do look sexy.
disagreements over the best way to respond to these threats, because already the incursions have caused a wide variety of opinions.
I can't get a KK drop to save my life. Oh, that's what you mean you're jealous of my Drygors.
Congressman Joe
I see.
Wilson saying, quote, this is an act of war. And meanwhile, the Prime Minister of the United
That
Kingdom,
sucks.
Seymour
Going dry
Clean
KK's gotta be
saying,
ass.
Quote, it's extremely reckless move, which only serves to remind us of President Putin's blatant
Yeah, a lot of people.
disregard
Apparently,
for
a
peace.
lot of people.
The
It's
US
like the.
response so far has
For
been
KK is like the
less alarming
next of old
compared
school.
to NATO
Fucking a lot of people
with the
hate
president
KK.
saying, quote, "It could
Despite
have been a
that
mistake," end quote. It's important to note that there's some 10,000 U.S. troops stationed in Poland who are at risk to these types of attacks. Some of the evidence that suggests
fuck do I have to-
it's not simply a misunderstanding.
I don't care about the fish, man. I'm gonna fucking crash out.
They appear to have come from the enemy's presence. Russian forces happen to already be in Belarus right now.
He's about to crash out.
With the large-scale
This is very much included.
Got a third age scythe currently.
Wouldn't
Nice.
be the first time that Russian troops had used military
third
training drills
age.
as a cover for an attack. However, it's also true that Russian drones crash landing all over the region is not that unusual. Russian drones have even crossed into Poland as early as last week.
Where the
Over
fuck?
past
No,
year, there's been
don't make me do a.
multiple
I gotta do a quest
For what?
Or the Baltic.
to get my
See this-
gear
these
upgraded
reports are
from level
all
40 to
right.
level
Lithuania
50.
has caught Russian
Man.
drones crashing on their territory. Also prompted scrambling
Why?
jets just earlier this year. You might recall earlier in the invasion.
I feel your pain,
of
brother.
Ukraine back in November of 2022, a missile landed in Poland.
But
killing
why?
two people near the border. Originally, it was believed to be a Russian missile, but a full investigation by Polish authorities later revealed that it was an air defense missile that had been misfired from Ukraine. So, an armed Russian attack drones have landed inside of Lviv.
It's okay. Just go get a bucket of water,
Days reported over the past few years.
chocolate
In
milk,
these instances, each
deep
country
grass.
said, you know what?
Water.
And they didn't use it as a reason to have a full-on freak-out over it. So why is it different this time? What's different now than all those other occasions? A security official from Belarus said it was because the drones had been jammed that they went into Poland in the first place. Russia's senior diplomat in Poland, named Ordash, said, quote, we consider the accusations
Man, I hope
grounded.
next week
No
all this
evidence
shit's
that
like
these
auto
drones are
completed because
Russian
this is just
drones
like the
has been
biggest waste of
presented.
fucking
I
time
guess
ever.
implying that these are Ukrainian. Russia's absolutely not
Please,
interested
please, I
in
beg.
escalation of
There's
Poland.
definitely some things they'll need to
But
do differently for next
unfortunately,
week.
there is no
That's for
reason to
sure.
expect that the Polish authorities and their anti-Russian
That is not a lie.
either. U.S. General Alexis Grinkovich, who's NATO's
tell me there's a
supreme
bucket down
allied
here.
commander in Europe,
There's a
said
bucket down here.
this was an intentional act or an unintentional act. It's possible that Ukrainian countermeasures could divert attack
Bird
drones.
of
It's
water.
true. I remember when I was deployed inside of Ukraine, the front line, my phone would get spoofed and my phone would suddenly show my location on the map. Google Maps, for instance, is somewhere 300 miles to the east or west. Sometimes my phone GPS would say that I was in Poland. Sometimes it would say I was in Russia. The point is, when you spoof a drone, it could send
How the
it
fuck
far
I get my
off
hands on
coast, making
chocolate
it
milk?
it was somewhere else. Together, jamming can send drones many miles off course because they navigate using these
Oh,
automated
thank
systems.
goodness
I've
that
been
I
sitting on a
have
computer flying each and every
both of
one
them.
of these drones for 16 hours straight to reach their targets. That's all automated using satellites. But Poland and many other nations are saying that this was deliberate because the way Russian drones react to electronic warfare is supposedly one of two ways. They either fly straight back towards the place of origin, or the second way is that they go off course and crash, but what they don't do is they don't fly on a deliberate path to key military targets in random, because one of the drones even landed at a military base according to initial reports. It's not surprising at all that people deny their involvement, right? That's kind of par of the course. We would expect that. What is surprising, I think, to me, is how NATO didn't downplay it this time as just an accident like all the other times in the past. Excuse for it, but that's not cool all the time experience like this. But now as a Russian further escalation, to me, that's something. But here's the thing, guys. Russia's launched similar size attacks on France in the past, and this didn't happen before those times.
Wait, let's not interrupt that.
Covert actions inside Poland since 2023. Russia's recruited people for money and tax them with scouting seaports, hiding tracking devices in military cargo, and even plotting to derail trains carrying weapons to Ukraine. Russian sabotage campaigns have been linked to warehousing fires all the way in Finland, an attack against the dam in Norway, and multiple cables cut under the Baltic Sea. It doesn't take a military genius mastermind to recognize that a drone attack on Zeshov would be a major goal, or even forcing more security in this region slows down shipments of this military aid and makes them move on further than I can. I'm surprised to recently learn that Russia's been flying surveillance drones over logistic routes the United States uses to ship this military aid through eastern Germany. So Russia's operating drones already in Germany, way further west than Poland. They're collecting intelligence with these drones that we use for future sabotage efforts. It also gives them advance notice of when different types of weapon systems are arriving at the front line in Ukraine. The thing is, this is exactly the kind of plausible deniable operation that characterizes gray zone hybrid warfare operations. Because right now it's difficult to prove one way or the other, really. This can be done incrementally, each time testing the limits without outright triggering a case of full-blown war. I mean, it's a tough call to respond with missiles or strongly worded letters. That's the big strategic dilemma of hybrid warfare. Personally, I don't think that's actually what really happened here, because in the past, when these kind of drones would crash in other nations, sometimes they often would be armed, which is how they normally would be, and that would suggest that it's an accident. But since they're all unarmed in this case, it seems like, so far, this appears to have been a dry run test of the NATO alliance to see how the members respond to being poked and prodded like this. But I, of course, can't be 100% certain. That's the whole point in hybrid warfare, though. It means that little bit room down, that voice in the back of your head that always tells you, you're making a mistake, you're wrong. That's the voice that makes taking any kind of decisive unified action in hybrid warfare so difficult. All of this comes just 1 month after the U.S. generals released plans for the NATO Eastern Flank Defense Plan, which is designed to prevent this kind of hybrid war attack from ever happening. On the diplomatic level, the drone incursion caused Poland's government to invoke Article 4 of the NATO treaty. What's Article 4? I love bureaucracy as much as the next person, and this is, my friends, a mechanism. It doesn't force members to take any action, but it could pave the way for a joint response. This has been invoked 8 times only since the alliance was founded, so it's kind of Article 5 light. What this raises is a bunch of uncomfortable questions now about how to respond to what are being called below-the-threshold attacks. Below the threshold means anything short of launching a missile at a country and saying, yeah, I did it, what are you going to do about it? If you're interested in learning about missiles in warfare and how the line between drones and missiles is being blurred, check out the video here that we recently made on it. I'm very proud of it. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, and you're happy.
a long bone. That's crazy weird.
It's Thursday the 18th of September, press conference in the UK. President Donald Trump made a stunning announcement. The US wanted to retake Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. Although it was delivered in his trademark style and off-the-cuff tangent presented as a scoop for the reporters in the room, Trump's comment represents a major shift in US foreign policy. After more than 4 years, the US might once again have boots on the ground in Afghanistan. The announcement was shocking because it was the first Trump administration that initiated America's withdrawal from Afghanistan after signing a peace deal with the Taliban. A deal that, lest we forget, resulted in American forces slipping out of Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night without telling the Afghan army and leaving behind more than $7 billion worth of military equipment. The Afghan government collapsed soon after and the Taliban stepped to power. And now, apparently the Americans want back in. Kabul's response was swift, with Al-Amara, one of the Taliban's official publications, describing Trump's remarks as an assault on national sovereignty and an insult to the feelings of the Afghan people. Trump doubled down, writing on Truth Social, and we'll quote him here, "If Afghanistan doesn't give Bagram Air Base back to those that built it, the States of America, bad things are going to happen." Bad things. All caps, followed by some exclamation points, because, of course it is. Trump's insistence and the sudden change in policy raises a lot more questions than it answers. First of all, why Bagram and why now? Second, is the US really going back to Afghanistan? And third, and perhaps most importantly, what does this mean for a region where China is seeking to increase its influence?
Have you ever landed in a new country and instantly regretted not sorting your data plan in advance? Oh my lord, so many times. So many times have I racked up that internet bill. Like, why? Why has this happened? Well, that's where today's sponsor Sailor steps in. Sailor is an eSIM app, so no physical SIM swapping, no shady airport vendors, no roaming fees that will sneak up on you later. You just download the app, you pick a plan, and you are good to go. You're connected in over 190 countries. One install covers multiple destinations. It's all very fast, it's cheap, and it just works. No plastic cards, no nonsense, no fussing around. So, download the Sailor app and use the code WARFRONTS to get 15% off your data plan. Or just go to sailor.com/WARFRONTS. Again, that's code WARFRONTS at checkout for 15% off. And now back to today's episode. Alright, to understand why Trump is fixated on this specific patch of Afghani US we geography and population as a whole. First, the town of Bagram is located about 60 kilometers from Kabul, close enough to easily monitor the capital, but far enough away to be easily defensible. It's in fact both the Soviet Union, the actual base of the Bagram Air Base, by the way, and the US are taking advantage of their respective occupations. When American and Allied forces arrived in 2001, they built the base, fixing years of bombing during the fashionable fighting of the 1990s. Bagram quickly grew as America's largest military installation in Afghanistan, housing more than 100,000 soldiers at its peak and featuring 2 massive runways capable of handling heavy transport planes. And that brings us to our second point. Logistics. Because Afghanistan is landlocked and surrounded by countries and militaries that are not particularly important to the United States, Bagram became a key node in America's military supply chains. If the US ends up retaking the base, these elements are still going to be important. Washington could use Bagram to monitor the Taliban in Kabul, and the airbase will undoubtedly be critical for moving troops and supplies without relying on vulnerable road networks. However, they won't be the main factor. That, in Trump's own words, is China. During the UK press conference, President Trump mentioned Bagram is an hour away. China is building its weapons. He was referring to Western Xinjiang province, where China borders Afghanistan, and according to a policy brief by the non-profit think tank, the Orion Policy Institute, the site of Beijing's rapid nuclear buildup. Quoting the brief here, the silo construction at Yumen and Hami in Xinjiang constitutes the most significant expansion of the Chinese nuclear arsenal ever. With 120 silos under construction at Yumen, another 110 silos at Hami, a dozen silos at Jilantai, and possibly more silos being added, the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF, appears to have approximately 250 silos under construction, and 10 times the number of continental buildings missile silos in operation today. End quote.
China's nuclear arsenal might go even further as Beijing increased defense spending by 7.2% this year. The explosive, pun intended, growth of China's nuclear program explains the urgency with which Trump is trying to take back Bagram. For decades, Washington has relied on a network of overseas bases to rapidly respond to crises and to reassure allies that the US can project power when needed. That network stretches across Europe, the Middle East, and even Africa, but since leaving Afghanistan, not into Central Asia. China's westward nuclear expansion is happening as America's window to regain a foothold in Central Asia is closing. For the Trump administration, the US needs boots on the ground, or at least eyes and ears, close enough to track what's happening and show allies and enemies alike that America hasn't given up the region. Although other locations have been considered, they each present significant obstacles. According to the New York Times, after the 2021 withdrawal, the Pentagon explored placing troops in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. However, Kazakhstan and Tajikistan are members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, Russia's alternative to NATO. While the alliance was described as lifeless by Dr. Thomas Ambrosio, a professor of political science at North Dakota State University, it would still make it extremely difficult for America to establish bases in those countries. Uzbekistan, although not a member of the CSTO, and despite President Mirziyoyev's recent meeting with Trump on the sidelines of the summit, has its own constraints. According to Polish think tank Warsaw Institute, Uzbekistan's 2012 foreign policy and 2018 defense doctrines explicitly prohibit foreign military bases from operating on its territory. This leaves Bagram as the most strategically obvious choice for the United States, not just because of its proximity, it's about 2,400 kilometers from the silos in Honey, but because it's the least complicated, underscoring just how truly limited America's options are. This is a point that former National Security Advisor Mike Waltz has been hammering on about for years. In an op-ed for the Military Times, he argued that abandoning Bagram meant the US was walking away from the only airbase in the world located in a country that physically borders China. Apart from the surveillance potential, Walls believes that having a base in Afghanistan would allow the United States to open a second front in a possible war over Taiwan, increasing the odds of victory. Waltz also points to Afghanistan's mineral wealth as another reason why the US shouldn't have left. US Geological Survey estimates peg the value of Kabul's untapped rare earth deposit at around $1 trillion. In Waltz's view, having access to those minerals would reduce American dependence on China, which controlled over 69% of rare earth mine production in 2024 and nearly half of the world's reserves. Now, we do have to note here that the US previously spent nearly $500 million developing Afghanistan's mining industry. Corruption and a lack of infrastructure meant they had next to nothing to show for this astronomical sum. Although Waltz is no longer National Security Advisor, having been reassigned to the UN after Signalgate, he is still a member of Trump's inner circle. And regional observers such as Lisa Curtis, director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for American Security, believe his strategic vision continues to shape the president's foreign policy decisions. Speaking to DW, she suggested that Waltz had planted the seeds of an idea about Bagram Air Base into Trump's mind. That seed has now sprouted into a tree whose first focus on Trump's words on the 18th of September. As its shadow looms over Central Asia, we have to ask, how likely is it that American forces are going to go back to Afghanistan?
Just as we go any further, just a quick pause to tell you about something we've been cooking up here at Warfronts, and we are excited to share it. And no, it's not the launch of Weeb Fronts. Jesus Christ, leave me alone. I've got enough channels. But I think it might be nearly as good as that. So have you ever got to the end of the week and found yourself thinking something along the lines of, oh man, I was just feeling so optimistic about the state of the world, and I'd love for that to be ruined by even more war fronts. Now bring me down nicely. Well, good news for you, my friend, I hear you. In fact, we are here, Warfronts, hear you so loudly, we're launching a brand new... So look at this, I set this up. That's where you can go. It's a place for people who see us putting out 6 videos a week and go, Amazon provide all of you access to 2 exclusive videos each and every week. The first 2
are already up on whether Poland could win a war against Russia. Pretty timely, we know, you're welcome. And on just how South Korea came to make the best tank on Earth. And we've got a lot more in the pipeline, including a weekly show covering the 3 most important war stories everybody else is ignoring, as a bonus. Rise is also producing 2 in-depth written articles a week for those of you old-fashioned. And now you're thinking, oh no, we're going to pay more videos. This sucks. Look, I have learned from the mistakes that every other YouTuber who launches something like this before me has made. No, we're still on YouTube. Everything is as it was before. There are still those 6 videos a week that we are grinding away making for you. You're so welcome. Everything on fronts.co is a bonus for those of you who want to cough up the princely sum of $5 American a month. So, if you want more of my face delivering important but oh so depressing news straight to your eyeballs, head over to fronts.co. God damn it, it's this side. It's so hard. My preview monitors. Here, fronts.co, not com. I couldn't get the com. The co is expensive enough. That's fronts.co, not com. And now back to today's video. Thank you. It also helps support the show. That wasn't in the copy, but it also helps us make videos, and thank you so much. Back to the episode. Now, the answer to this question kind of depends on who you ask. For President Trump, it is a definite yes. Speaking with reporters on Saturday, he said, and I quote him here, "We're talking now to Afghanistan, and we want it back, and we want it back soon. Right away. If they don't do it, you're going to find out what I'm going to do." This statement suggested 2 things. One, that his administration was negotiating directly with the Taliban about a possible return to Afghanistan. And 2, that Trump is willing to escalate if things don't go his way. For the Taliban, on the other hand, their answer isn't just no, it comes with a side of... They're not just rejecting American plans, they're actually requiring denying that any negotiations will occur. The geopolitics will be one side of negotiations take place. It is possible that back channel talks
Trying to get lasty boots, but no luck either.
Doha, but
Lacerations. Those would be nice.
According to Shadi Khan Saif, a former Afghanistan and Pakistan correspondent for Reuters,
Nah, it still gave me the Takar Kalket.
Humiliation,
Fuck.
violating the sovereignty they fought to reclaim. Therefore, if negotiations...
I tried my absolute fucking best to fucking death skulls every chance I had.
Appearing uncompromising at home while trying to extract concessions from
Well,
the administration. For Trump, on the other hand,
I guess I can use this to make like an amulet of souls or something.
Taliban on the back foot, part of his vaunted art of the deal. Yet even if negotiations are happening,
Yo,
and they are
fucking move,
somehow
you
going
big-ass
well,
bitch.
that doesn't mean that they'll come to anything. Deals between nations, even those that are allies, can and often do fall through,
Holy
weighed down by
shit.
politics and
RS3
shifting
hitboxed
priorities.
this man.
Now imagine a deal between 2 nations whose worldview couldn't be more diametrically opposed. 2 nations that have killed thousands of each other's soldiers. It shouldn't come as a surprise then, but most regional observers believe that it won't happen. The Taliban have constantly pointed to the Doha Agreement's pledge that the United States would not threaten Afghanistan's territorial integrity, using it as a shield against...
Yeah, I'll go get my Zucking now. I can't be
Trump
bothered.
is unlikely to use military force
Not getting
to
all of
capture
them.
the airbase.
Ooh, I should get another Onyx real quick though. Sure, it'll be fast since now I'm not going to be bothered with wasting time with another style.
Billions at a
Should
time
get
when
2
the
Onyxes so I can make my
weary of the
Essence of
cost
Finality.
wars, and it will cost Trump political capital, as he would be going against his pledge.
You need 2
to
Hydruxes.
start a new war.
3 actually.
Internationally, it would attract condemnation from other major powers. China has already accused the US of
All right,
stirring
we'll hold
tensions
off on
and
that.
creating confrontations, an accusation that might be the ultimate example of the pot calling the kettle a warmonger. But one which would obviously ring true if the US went in all guns blazing. Russia, too, would seize on any American return to Afghanistan as justification for its own actions. The Kremlin would argue that if the United States can disregard the Doha Agreement, Moscow can disregard any international treaties. Again, there's some serious pot kettle vibes going on there, isn't there? But it would give Putin even more justification to keep trying to annex his neighbors. Even among America's allies who reluctantly supported the Afghan mission for 2 decades, there is little appetite for a return.
Man, I
In
gotta
this
go
case,
do
if the deal
rune
falls
crafting
through,
now,
Trump will probably
bro.
impose
Oh,
even harsher sanctions on
man.
the Taliban, allowing him to
Oh,
retain
boy.
his image as a tough negotiator while avoiding the fallout of sending American soldiers back to Afghanistan. We have to point out,
Fine.
though, that the effectiveness of any extra sanctions is unclear given the sheer scale
The things
of
I
the
do for low.
sanctions already on Afghanistan. In the unlikely scenario where a deal does happen, it will probably not be a base handover, nor will it have anywhere near the number of soldiers that once filled Bagram. Experts that DW spoke to believe that the most probable scenario is that the Taliban allows a small number of intelligence officers into the country to help fight Washington and Kabul's common enemy, the Islamic State, Khorasan Province, or ISIS-K, a regional branch of ISIS. Since the Taliban took over, they have clamped down on ISIS-K, but have been unable to stamp it out completely, even with Russia's help. A targeted US presence focused on rooting out the insurgents would allow both sides to achieve some of their objectives without being seen to capitulate. Lisa Curtis.
Oh, you don't need a flawless run to get the stone.
The Taliban
Awesome.
would likely want to keep that out of the public eye because of the questions of sovereignty. So,
Don't get flawless
what
for
would
hard
the
mode.
Taliban get in this scenario? Well, that would be the lifting of some sanctions and normalization of the relationship with the United States. Kabul recently announced a prisoner exchange deal with the US as part of normalization efforts, and a potential
Damn,
deal
that shit makes a
no
lot
matter
of
how
runes
narrow
though.
the
Holy
scope
shit.
would go a long way in helping to achieve that goal. Kabul might also request aid for its citizens who are still reeling after a magnitude 6 earthquake struck the nation on the 31st of August, killing 2,200 people, destroying 5,000 homes, and making an already precarious economic situation even worse. The earthquake happened amidst threats from the Trump administration to freeze all aid to the nation. UN reports indicate the humanitarian aid to Kabul has dropped by nearly 50%,
Alright.
which according to health workers and aid officials has impacted their ability to rescue people. If presented as an aid for access bargain, the Afghan people might not be opposed to American forces. Only time is going to tell if the Taliban choose to take that route. America's struggle to make a deal with the Taliban and find a foothold in Central Asia, emblematic of a world that is moving further away from the United States and embracing its main geopolitical adversary, China. Political commentator Ghaffar Hussain, in an interview with DW, put it this way: I don't think America has anything that the Taliban really wants right now. If they want loans, China can offer that. If they want, aid, China can offer that. China's kind of muscled America out, if you like, so they don't really need America for anything. End quote. The US no longer commands the economic or political leverage that once justified its presence. Beijing's growth as a rival capable of investing in infrastructure and industries like mining has reshaped power dynamics not just in Kabul, but across the broader region. Meanwhile, Russia is trying to establish itself as a reliable security partner for states in the region, despite recent claims by Trump that it's a paper tiger. And more than that, they are actively blaming Washington for the region's instability. Vasily Nebenzia, Russia's ambassador to the UN, attributed the increasing threat of ISIS-K in a speech to the UN. Nebenzia said, and we'll quote him here, "The growing activity of ISIL Khorasan is no coincidence. While hastily leaving Afghanistan, NATO troops abandoned vast quantities of weapons and equipment there, which then fell into the hands of ISIL inter alia." End quote. Those accusations carry weight in regional capitals, and so far Washington hasn't proven capable of countering them. According to Miras Zhiembaev, the head of foreign policy analysis at the International Studies Program at a Kazakhstan-based think tank, Washington needs to have...
Oh, hell no, nigga, you're smoking crack. 99 crafting for the Amulet of Souls.
...consistently implemented at the ground level. He believes that the region serves as a pragmatist who prioritize economic growth, security, and sovereignty, and hate
worth it,
being
though.
forced to choose sides.
Nah, it is, but goddamn.
With China on roads and with Russia on security, while
Aye.
courting the EU for trade and the Gulf for capital. Kazakhstan, for example, despite being a member of the CSTO and hosting special trainings for the group, has recently been cozying up to China and the West to guard against a potential Russian invasion of its northern territories. These areas have a large ethnically Russian population and might be the Kremlin's next target in a post-Ukraine war world. Washington needs to exist in this new reality where its offers are not seen as inherently better than the competition's, but rather as part of a broader regional tapestry. No one expects Central Asia to be the administration's immediate focus, with everything happening in Ukraine and the Middle East. However, the US shouldn't completely leave the region up to the other powers. If this happens, then Washington risks reinforcing the image of a country pulling back and looking inward while rivals carve out bigger roles in Central Asia. It will communicate that America is comfortable watching from the sidelines while Beijing and Moscow shape the region's future. Once that perception takes hold, it will become difficult to shake off because both allies and enemies will begin planning around an absent America. And the longer this is allowed to persist, the harder it becomes for America to regain credibility. Thank you for watching.
I see. It really is gonna suck to, well, not really suck, but there's no real way to boost that well.
Bars. Do I have a notepad? Oh my god, my background. I forgot about that.
Six to seven. What does that mean?
Don't mind that. Don't mind that. I just did that so I can remind myself on something. I had to put it
Word.
somewhere.
Nah, I feel you. I know. I'll be doing that.
If I can get this to level 50 and I still can't augment it, I'm just gonna go in with the level 50 gear. Well, actually, never mind. I'm gonna get the freaking combat points so I can get other abilities, and then I'll go in. Hopefully, I don't run out of ink. If I run out of ink, I'm gonna be fucking upset.
Understandable.
Okay, I need to make. I'm definitely gonna run out of fucking ink.
He's gonna ink.
Oh, you're gonna make me ink.
17 kilometers northeast of Tehran, there's a city. So let's say the 18th of September. Welcome back to the Situation Room, the weekly show where you ask the depressing questions about the state of the world, and we give you the even more depressing answers. I, as always, am your host, Simon, and this week we're taking a deep dive into the developments in Haiti over the last few months. Spoiler alert, bad. We're also delving into the questions surrounding NATO's response, or otherwise, to growing Russian aggression, and weighing up not only the likelihood of a sneak Chinese attack on Taiwan, but also the qualities of the South Korean defense industry. Timestamps, as always, are below if you want to skip ahead, but I'd rather you didn't. So let's get started with the grimmest story of the week, the ongoing, seemingly endless collapse of Haiti. Gary Walker, 2825, asks us, can you give us an update on Haiti? What's going on there? How much worse is it? Well, Gary, it's telling that you included the phrase, how much worse is it? Not, are things getting better, or even, are things better or worse? No, Gary is asking the question, safe in the absolute certainty that things will have gone downhill in Haiti since it last appeared on this channel. And the sad part is, Gary, you're absolutely right. To Google Haiti's meltdown is to enter a strange parallel world in which things we take for granted, like law and order, or the basic value of human life, seem to have completely evaporated. And not in the face of marauding armies as in Sudan's civil war, but thanks to a toxic combination of a highly corrupt elite, a failed government, and the rise of ruthless gangs who fill the vacuum. Here are the latest figures that we could find, and they make for oh so grim reading. Over 1.3 million people displaced by violence, over 6 million people experiencing severe hunger as gangs block supply roads and render ports and airports inoperable. As for the murders, well, the numbers differ.
Not a souls ain't that important right now. I'll AFK that shit later.
Published by the UN claims that 4,000 people were murdered between January and May of this year, but a separate report that only focuses on those dead in gang violence puts the figure closer to 3,100 killed in the first half of the year. Now look, if you're from a violent nation like Ecuador or South Africa, those figures may look grim, but, not unprecedented. South Africa suffered over 5,700 murders just in the first 3 months of this year alone. The differences, however, are twofold. First, South Africa has a far larger population than Haiti, 64 million South Africans compared to 11 million Haitians. Second, murders aren't the only thing killing a large number of Haitians. The total breakdown of society is causing all sorts of wild excess mortality. The New Humanitarian has detailed the way gangs have looted and burned hospitals and, in general, made seeking medical care in Haiti so dangerous that few health centers remain functional. As a result, quote, there are car accident victims, asthma patients gasping for air, people with chronic illnesses needing urgent medication, all left to fend for themselves. Gunshot victims lie bleeding with no hospital to save them. On top of all that, there's been a recent rise in drone attacks attributed to aggressive new tactics by both the Haitian National Police and the private military group Vectus Global, run by Eric Prince and hired in spring by Haiti's Transitional Presidential Council. Kamikaze drones crashing into gang-held areas across Port-au-Prince are fast becoming a commonish sight. The main problem, though, is that they have a gruesome track record of also killing civilians. This was on display just recently when 2 drones laden with explosives were flown into a birthday party in the Cité Soleil slum that was being thrown for the gang leader Juma. While 4 gang members were reportedly killed in the subsequent blast, so were 8 children playing in the street, including a girl as young as 4. Overall, it's estimated that just in the first few months of the drone strikes between April
give me
and
the
June
pet,
this
damn it.
year, 236 people were killed, of whom none were high-ranking gangsters. Nor was this a one-off. Another botched drone attack earlier in September is thought to have
On the
killed
pet, damn it.
civilians. Awful as this is, though, you could argue that
I don't know. When it's like
turn to the use of drones,
I probably should be taking the Araxi arrows, but at the same time, I'm just like,
A police force was deployed to Port-au-Prince,
Araxi arrows,
went
for
back
what?
in an attempt to smash the gang.
That's kind of what's running through my mind for what.
Well-trained police, backed up by
So I'm just
high-tech
rolling
equipment
pet
and
every
funded
time
to the
it's not
tune of
something I want.
$800 million to pacify the gangs long enough to relieve the capital's humanitarian crisis. Instead, the force was given old and unsuitable equipment, received only $112 million in funding, and never exceeded 1,000
Okay,
personnel.
I need to buy some.
1,000 people, tasked with protecting a city of 1.2 million. It failed.
Did you make a
Unsurprisingly. With the
you
policing
make a left
mission's
with the doors?
mandate due to run out this
Me?
week, talk
No,
is
I
now
haven't
turning
yet.
into an alternative force.
The United States and Panama
Could use my Onyx for that.
a 5,500 personnel gang suppression force to combat Haiti's gangsters.
You're right. I'll make one. I'm looking something up right now, but I should make one. Okay, let's see. Monkey Kong
collapsed in 2024, declared its support for the plan. But major hurdles do remain. For one, this isn't an offer from the US to put boots on the ground.
Oh no, I'm gonna run out of ink.
Alright, Port Hazard.
Instead, it's supposed to be UN authorized and funded. But that would require the Security Council to sign off on it. Russia and China currently vetoing every plan the US brings before the Council. That means the idea is basically dead on arrival. Meanwhile, things just keep getting worse. According to America's Quarterly, the gang system is growing more and more entrenched as the Haitian state retreats, setting up a patchwork of fiefdoms where gang leaders provide basic services to the population they prey upon. Meanwhile, the mandate of the Transitional Presidential Council is due to run out in February, almost 2 years after it formed. 2 years in which the council failed to provide security or prepare Haiti for national elections, and in which its members mostly just squabbled among themselves. When that happens, Haiti will have no remaining group with claim to legitimacy. All elected politicians long ago finished serving their terms. The current prime minister was appointed. The council was hastily cobbled together by outside powers after the government imploded, and many of the political elite are additionally suspected of being tied to the gangs.
Oh, he's getting bananas.
So thank you, Gary.
Next time, Lot Hour, I want to
both
go ahead and
sincerely
get my
and
summoning shit
Thank you,
together.
in all honesty, for
Get me
asking
some
that
yaks.
question, allowing us to do a deep dive.
But I don't think I'm going to have enough
Thank you
time to do it this...
sarcastically for making
Well,
us all feel
I'm
good.
just not going to do it this hour because I
And
wanted to
now,
do
let's
everything in
have
one
another,
go.
hopefully lighter question.
Get my
Just before going further, just a quick pause to tell you about something we've been cooking up here at Warfronts, and we are excited to share it. And no, it's not the launch of Weeb Fronts. Jesus Christ, leave me alone. I've got enough channels. But I think it might be nearly as good as that. So have you ever got to the end of the week and found yourself thinking something along the lines of, oh man, I was just feeling so optimistic about the state of the world, and I'd love for that to be ruined by even more war fronts. That would bring me down nicely. Well, good news for you, my friends. I hear you. In fact, we at Warfronts hear you so loudly, we're launching a brand new... It's that side. Subscriber service. Look at this. I set this up. That's where you can go. It's a place for people who see us putting out 6 videos a week and go, amateurs. For $5 a month, you'll get access to 2 exclusive videos each and every week. The first 2 are already up on whether Poland could win a war against Russia. Pretty timely, we know you're welcome. And on just how South Korea came to make the best tank on Earth. And we've got a lot more in the pipeline, including a weekly show covering the 3 most important war stories everybody else is ignoring. And as a bonus, our writers are also producing 2 in-depth written articles a week for those of you who like to get their information the old-fashioned way. And now we know what you're thinking. Oh man, they're going to paywall videos. This sucks. Look, I have learned from the mistakes that every other YouTuber who launches something like this.
Your
before me
backspiders
has
are the
made.
worst.
No, we're still on YouTube.
Yes,
Everything
the
is as it
fuck
was
they
before.
are.
There are still those 6 videos a week that we are grinding away making for you. You're so welcome. Everything on fronts.co is a bonus for those of you who want to cough up the
Just
princely sum of
one-shot
$5
myself on
American
one by
dollars a month.
accident.
So,
Oof.
if you want more of my face delivering important but oh so depressing news straight to your eyeballs, head over to fronts.co. God damn it, it's this side. It's so hard. My preview monitors. Here, fronts.co, not com. I couldn't get the com. The co was expensive enough. That's fronts.co, not com. And now back to today's video. Thank you. It also helps support the show. That wasn't in the copy, but it also helps us make videos, and thank you so much. Back to the episode. A Russian trilogy. Next
No,
up,
I almost
from
have wars
Ash and
for
Leon,
more.
Putin is 72 and stuck in a war that at this rate he may not
course.
live to see the end of. Do you anticipate him ever stepping down and announcing a successor? If not, how messy will things get when he dies? Also, why does he keep prodding at NATO when he doesn't have the resources to actually do anything after losing so much to Ukraine? Well, fantastic group of questions right there, and we'll run through them in sequence. Do we anticipate Putin ever stepping down and announcing a successor? No, probably not, unless he became aware of seriously declining cognitive capacities or suffered from a major health emergency that made him unable to lead. In that case, Putin might attempt to make a peaceful transition. Other than that, it's difficult to see him ever passing his power along, not least because any true successor would likely perceive him as a threat for as long as he still lives. As for how messy things will get when he dies, well, probably very, very messy for a relatively small group of people. Ordinary Russian citizens have got very accustomed to Putin's social contract. Stay out of politics, and for the most part, Putin's politics stay out of their lives. Between that and Putin's destruction of the peaceful Russian opposition, the public lacks any real means of political participation, even if they did care to get involved. Instead, a battle of succession would most likely play out within the oligarchy, with powerful factions backing the most powerful potential candidates and quite possibly spilling blood to see their preferred successor get the throne. And as for why Putin keeps prodding at NATO when he doesn't have the resources to fight a war against NATO, well, because right now it's not clear that Putin would have to fight NATO if he decides to attack one of its member nations. That's what Putin is trying to test out. If Russia acts aggressively towards a NATO member, will the alliance actually show up and do something? Right now, it's true, Putin doesn't have the resources to take on the NATO alliance and win outright, but he sure as hell has the resources to take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania if the alliance does nothing, not to mention what he could do to a non-NATO member like Moldova or tiny little Georgia. So Putin's trying to find out whether he can get those nations into a one-on-one battle or whether NATO is really going to prevent him from doing so. And now a closely related question from Lennox Map number 1. We see Putin pushing NATO's limits over and over, but what non-NATO country could you see him pivoting to attack rather than seeking a direct confrontation with the alliance? And, well, we just mentioned a couple of options a moment ago. Moldova, which has held its parliamentary elections just yesterday amidst widespread allegations of Russian meddling, although we recorded this on Saturday, actually Sunday. I didn't do it yesterday, I'm sorry. We don't know the results yet. Georgia, where the pro-Russia Georgian Dream Party has effectively neutered the country's ability and will to defend itself. But it's also worth mentioning Kazakhstan, where politicians and rights activists are raising alarms that Russia may intend to take direct military action. Recently, pro-Russian politicians in Kazakhstan have been trying to pass the same anti-media and foreign agent laws that Russia has, and Putin has taken to referring to Kazakhstan basically as if it's a part of Russia, in an eerie echo of his rhetoric on Ukraine. Russia is thought to have designs on Kazakhstan's more northerly territory.
I'm not playing League, but do you level faster on League or something? You sure do. You level way faster.
Economic dependence on Moscow, while not
the Terramon right now has got 16 times XP.
No clear sign that an invasion of Kazakhstan is imminent, but it is the sort of possibility that,
16 times the thirsting power.
And one final one on Russia from Stephen Booth 3117. With Poland threatening Russia with shooting down a plane if they violate NATO airspace again, what threat do you think Russia would actually listen to? Well, we'd actually argue that shooting down a Russian plane is a really good place to start. Specifically, you might
So are you questing?
Experts make reference to Turkey.
Kinda, sorta.
And the reason for that is that in 2015, NATO members...
Yeah, I'm doing this first part of the quest so I can unlock a certain shop.
...to handle exactly this sort of crisis. Back then, Turkey was dealing with frequent incursions and threats.
Yep, XP is super duper fast, and you get some things that make skilling itself faster. There's a lot of reasons, but in general, skilling's just way, way, way faster.
Along the Syrian border. Within just 17 seconds, a Turkish F-16 had fired its air-to-air missiles.
God, what a nightmarish overlap for me.
Tumbling from the sky. The
Huh?
shoot-down was an international incident. Russia said the former ship...
I had like a bunch of spitting spiders still like chugging around, and then it went in darkness off in Narnia.
Systems into Syria. Turkey flooded the global press with its receipts surrounding the incident, showing exactly what Russia had done and exactly how Turkey had
bottom path for you.
Respond in precisely the way that
And top path.
And surprise, surprise, it has been a very long time since a Russian aircraft crossed into Turkish airspace. Russia doesn't have the resources, the aircraft, or the pilots.
It does not become a regular character account. I'm pretty sure once this is gone, the accounts are wiped.
Incredible numbers of drones and missiles, and it could deal devastating damage to NATO member nations. But it is not equipped to even challenge
how mad the community
of NATO airspace in any serious way. Putin can capture NATO
And so much gold to be dumped into the game.
if Putin can prove that NATO is
for real.
in that territory. So right now, the most valuable thing that NATO can do is leave absolutely no doubt about what will happen
It'd be
to
cool
Russian
to keep them,
assets,
but
manned or
alas,
not, if
everything
they
must come
decide
to an
to
end.
enter NATO airspace again. A sneak attack on Taiwan.
You better mirror
Alright,
bag.
let's pivot to Asia.
Ooh,
This
did
one
you get the mirror
from
bag?
Evan
Yeah, I did.
Perniawan.
I saw you use one ability and took like half your HP. I was like, oh.
That'd be sick if it stuck around. Yeah, they did something similar on Old School called Fresh Start Worlds, and it was like kind of peeled back a bit on the accelerated gameplay, but people did get to keep their accounts afterwards. Pretty cool.
Considering that Ukraine managed to do some big surprises even in extremely transparent environments, I wonder if China has the chance to do that. Well, there are a couple of
wrong
issues
leg.
to discuss here. Number one, China secretly
Did you
building
do
up
it,
its
like-
forces and
No,
China
wait, I took
actually
it.
managing to get its ships across the water.
Ah!
Secretly building up forces
I wanted to
on the
drag it and
Chinese
shake it.
mainland, it would be
Whoa.
difficult, but probably not impossible.
Hey,
There's so much movement of
you don't judge
cars,
me, okay, and I
buses,
don't judge
trains,
you.
and aircrafts and ferries all
Understood.
over China each day that certainly, over the course of a few weeks, China could quietly sneak marines and
I need
paratroopers
force
close to
spears.
Taiwan.
Fuck off.
Moving heavy equipment is tougher, but ground equipment like tanks and infantry fighting vehicles could be
Do I wanna keep
transported
killing
on
our
board
accent?
China's
Actually, you know what?
ferries, which are designed explicitly
I need
to
a.
carry tanks
I have a
and other
mission.
heavy armor.
Warriors
something I need
Guild.
to do.
But moving aircraft
Get spears from the Warriors Guild.
far more challenging, especially
No, yes,
near Taiwan are
Okay.
constantly monitored
What's
by
the
American,
kiln thing
European,
called? Is it
Taiwanese,
called-
Indo-Pacific, and
Elder
overseas
kiln.
satellite imagery?
Mm-hmm.
In order to hide the requisite number of aircraft and ships,
it a
China
mini
would first
quest?
have to embark on
Nah,
lengthy
you have to
construction
do a
projects
quest to
which
do
are
it though. It's called the
diligently
Elder Kiln is the name of the quest, and
And
Fight
once
Kiln is
China's
what it
assets
unlocks.
Get out to open water, well, they'll be easy to spot. In
Okay,
fact,
word.
it may not
What
be
do I need to unlock
strategically
Elder
wise for China
Kiln?
to reveal
Oh,
itself
God.
only when the blitz is underway.
Oh, Lord.
Taiwan, the US,
The Elder Kiln's
and
just a
other
quest.
Pacific allies are prepared to strike Chinese territory with all sorts of long-range
Warriors
missiles,
Guild, let's go.
other weapons, and
Oh wait,
Please,
of
please
course,
have mercy.
prize their
Oh, my
chance.
arm's
They
twitching.
can just fire off
Stop it.
everything they have in hopes of stopping the invasion in its tracks. If China instead
Okay.
chooses to advertise its welcome, it gives Taiwan and its other adversaries time
Stop
to
twitching, what's
second-guess,
wrong with you?
push for a peaceful settlement,
Sorry, I'm
build
coming.
their alliances, and
I'm gonna
the
come.
moment where China may
Yo.
believe it can get some of Taiwan,
Oh, I don't have 75 magic. That's why I can't see.
rating South Korea's
No,
defenses.
75 magic.
This one comes from Hi, my
damn
name
it.
is Leo.
So we have.
Leo, I've heard that South Korea.
You need to sacrifice a fire cape for Elder Kiln? I'm sure she has one already.
Does the country still
Yeah, I
need
have one.
USA protection? Well, firstly, you heard absolutely right. South Korea's defense industry is absolutely booming.
I love when he
and it's
splits
on a
that
clear
cape in
upward
half.
trajectory to
You
keep
see all the
booming in the
goo go
future.
everywhere.
South
He's
Korea's
like, hey,
food is
man,
high
this
quality,
shit garbage,
high
man.
tech, and it's cost effective, typically selling at prices
I wonder what-
below its biggest competitors.
I wonder what
and
it's like
most
that is in that
sustain
cape. Is it just
costs
lava?
even more
Just
affordable.
in the cape? It's just
All
currently
the
hot
cool
under
military
bed.
hardware in the world becomes
I,
irrelevant as soon as
I bet it
somebody
feels
starts
nice, like a
launching
heated blanket
nuclear
at all
warheads,
times.
right?
Mhm.
South Korea
Warm
relies
goodness.
I mean, it does make
entirely
sense on old
an
school when you do
American
winter time.
deterrent to
If you have a
protect
hurricane, it
itself
keeps you
from
warm.
nuclear North Korea and nuclear
Well,
China.
it looks like
In
this is as
terms of
far as I go in my
conventional
cape
warfighting
journey.
technology, South
I
Korea
am not
is
grinding for
miles
75
ahead of its
magic right now.
northern neighbor, and it's
I'll
even
be
an
damned.
interesting discussion to consider how much
Understandable.
damage South Korea could deal against China, although China would almost certainly win a war on the Korean Peninsula if it really committed to that effort. But none of that matters if Beijing and Pyongyang can just nuke South Korea into oblivion without the threat of being nuked into oblivion themselves. Not only that, but American aerial, naval intelligence, and logistics support would be vital in order to get South Korea even close to military
1,
parity
2,
in
3,
a war
4. I
against
need
China.
one more.
Unfortunately,
Back.
a booming defense industry by itself doesn't make a military superpower. South Korea is strong and getting stronger, but it is not ready to face any kind of heat.
I'm gonna make
by
this
itself.
gear and then.
And now let's move on to some behind-the-scenes
Break
questions.
many.
How many writers
Dude.
does it take from MWI 3865? How many writers are there for Warfronts? How many writers are there for all of the Simonverse channels combined? Well, this question kind of depends on what you mean by writers for Warfronts, because the answer changes if you focus on just the regulars or if you also include those who only submit occasionally. If you're talking about the regulars, then that's basically just three: Evan, Morris, and Wilfred. Wilfred, the latest edition from August, but is doing excellent work. Thank you, Wilfred. Welcome to the team. These are the guys responsible for the day-to-day content that you see, the quick turnaround stuff, or the analysis of things happening in the news. Evan and Morris are also the ones
Oh wait, I need
who write in
resources.
Situation
Whoopsie.
Room since it launched, so blame them for all of the endless references to WeFriends.
actually,
But these
wow.
three hallowed geniuses, who are so modest as well, are not the
Yeah,
only
go
ones
get points.
contributing. There are also our irregular writers, George, Paul, Philip, and Kyle. Those guys tend to submit when either they have the time
Right.
or when they have a particular idea that they think would really suit the channel.
the
So
fuck?
George might
I
do
gotta
an
see my
overview of
quest
the
progress.
North
What haven't I
Korean
done?
military and then vanish for 6 months. Paul might only crop up when there's stuff in the news that he's really knowledgeable about, like the outbreak of conflict between Thailand and Cambodia, or how an invasion
Almost
of
did
Taiwan
like
played out in
a
real
few
life.
kills at
Carl, meanwhile,
AOD
used
last
to write
night.
occasionally for the Situation Room, but has since moved over to our sister channel, political fronts.
But it didn't
Check
happen.
it out, and now only comes.
We didn't
back
have a
onto the
base
Morris
tank.
are both away, and we need
No base
someone
tank.
to
No
base
base tank for
know
what?
what?
Thank you.
AOD.
And then
I'm
we
working
invited
on
to
it.
submit once in a
I'll
blue
get
moon,
there.
guys like Arnaldo,
I'll be your base
where it was
tank.
a lovely piece comparing the Chinese and American navies, and then rode off into the sunset with a vague promise to return us.
Oh, these
some
spirit
money.
runes. Runes of
He hasn't
spirits.
yet.
Spirits of runes.
Or guys like the
You know
anonymous
what?
writer of our
Time to
recent
go
piece
kill
on Ukrainian
avian seas
drones who were hoping to entice
and
back
full
in.
melee gear
Finally, there
and
are
some
those who
rune
used to write for us
crossbows.
like Ollie, but then moved on
No,
to other
definitely
channels.
just take off the melee gear. It's gonna make your
So
range
that's
do less.
basically it. 3 roguish.
Oh, I know. I'm just gonna slap on some royal dehydes.
Where
Morris. Plus a wider constellation of smart, thoughtful people who submit when they can. Oh, and sorry, I guess there's a
Sweet
thing I should answer. How many
points.
for all of the channels? It's probably a few dozen. Like, same sort of thing. People submit
Dust
when they want to
points.
submit. I'd say a couple of dozen irregulars. Richard Van de Tulip, 4061, asks a question I've had for a
I'm gonna
while now.
bring.
Over the years,
Oh,
your
I should go get
research
my
into
prayer
games
up.
for
That's
several
another
of your
thing I
channels
should really
have
go do.
been increasingly involved in acquiring first-hand
99
sources. If I remember
99
correctly,
prayer.
you had a journalist
Yeah.
on the ground
Infinite
during the
money.
protests in Kenya. Indeed, we did.
I know.
And my
Oh,
question
true. I
is,
could go
how
do
does it
that.
feel
I didn't think about
first-hand
that.
sources and
I
perhaps
have
be
it
the
banked.
first
Like,
to
look at all
share
these dragon
the
bones I got
subject?
from my
Honestly, pretty good.
lengthy stay
But
at Vindicta.
we're still a tiny operation in the grand scheme of things. We're not going to be establishing bureaus yet and sending our core team to distant countries to report on stuff.
I,
But as War France has grown its audience, thank you
I would
so
definitely.
much.
I don't know
We
if
have
that's what
partners
Blaze said because I was honestly tuned out,
contacts
but
in
I
all
would
different
definitely
parts
just
of
go
the
buy
world.
cleansing
Some
crystals and
like
do it
Varroa
that way.
Elves,
I
some
would have
just
been used to
fans
those.
Is it
and
faster?
some are
Or is it
experts
just more
in
AFK?
like
Mm,
what we do. It's
It's
rather
definitely
kind of
nice.
both.
The upshot is that sometimes a big
Yeah, it's
spell
100% faster, but honestly.
Oh, I thought it was slower. I truthfully assumed it was gonna be slower, which is why I didn't bother. But if it's faster, no, nah, yeah, never mind. I'm gonna go get my 99.
Similar deal.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
At the same time,
It takes like no time at all for real.
more journalistic with some
Where
of
the
stories,
fuck
calling
is
people up
this
and
guy? What
asking
the
for
hell?
comment, that sort of thing. The fascinating part is who's willing to speak to you.
Alright,
One of
fuck
our
it,
team
let's
straight up
click
called a tank
on it
museum
then.
in Russia for a video on rumors that the Kremlin was refitting
In the
literal museum
east
pieces
of
to send to
Caterpie,
Ukraine,
okay.
and wound up having a really insightful conversation with the
Oh,
director. of
that
the
shop
place,
right
who
there,
was
I see
happy
it.
to answer the questions. Then during the recent Nepal protests, the protesters were more than willing to invite us to a private Discord group where they were discussing who should replace the
On a
ousted
boost
prime
roll, I got you
minister.
baited.
In short,
God dang it.
it's a lot of luck.
We're gonna go do
Super
fight
dependent
kill
on
with
who's
level
around and who's willing
50
to talk
necromancy
when
gear.
it
I'm
comes
not
to
making the level
these
61 hour.
videos
Rather
and extra
freaking heal
depth,
over and take it in the ass.
Pretty proud of that.
Wow.
Hey, yo,
I
Beth?
hope you guys like it. I think from the comments that you
Only
do,
get a piece
so
of that.
we hope to do it as much
Yo,
as
Scrumptious.
possible. And now the part of the show where we invite Evan and Morris out of the basement to give
Alright,
their opinions on
bronze
some
brutal
lighter
arrows.
questions,
Let's just
and
go
we'll
with
put them
those.
immediately back in there.
Of course, the number in stock is fucking
First one from
0.
James Price, 9139. A question for both Simon and the team.
Yeah, I swear
What's
they be
your
doing this shit on
favourite
purpose. It's
funny
like they
and/or
they know
mad war
what you're
story?
gonna do.
One of mine is the adventures of Private Wojtek, the
Zero
Polish
and stuff.
artillery bear, or for a modern
Oh,
example,
for
the
fuck's
Snake
sake.
Island
Okay.
Russian warship transmission. Yeah, it's
That's
pretty
how I
good.
felt when I was trying to
Evan,
make
go
that
first.
stupid ass apple
Got to be
pie.
the life of Mad
You
Jack
can buy from the
Churchill,
shop,
young
guess
man
what? You
who
can't.
went
It's
to the
zero.
army with the stones to bring his Scottish broadsword and bagpipes to
Fucking
fight against Nazi
piss
Germany.
me
But
off.
unfortunately,
Feather
not
per arrow
true that
shaft.
Churchill notched a
So
bow
I'm gonna need some
killed
arrow
German
shafts
against
and
42 Germans with the help of a single corporal and
clicking on Acula. Okay, so I need another Acculog.
blasting bagpipe music. Morris's answer. I'll never forget hearing about Gregor McGregor. I'm smiling because they didn't pick mine. Mine's more obvious, I think. Gregor McGregor's a good story, though. For the first time, an early 19th century
Finger of
swindler and
death.
all-round skill so immoral that he convinced hundreds of people that a fake country
Using
existed in Central
nails on
America,
them will make
got them to
brutal
invest in it,
arrows.
for which
Okay.
Reed give him all their money, and then send them out to near certain death on an empty Moscow
go to the
television
bank.
shore. But while the con is the most fascinating part of McGregor's life, the coolest
Wow,
part was
that's
much
kinda
later,
troll.
when he fought alongside Simon
I just saw how many
Bolivar,
Reaper points it
Venezuelan
gave me,
independence.
125,
At one point, the
which
con
means I'm
man
at
found himself cut off
like
and surrounded by royalist forces,
275 right now.
hundreds of kilometers from the nearest safe town. But rather than a surrender, he and his men marched
One off of my
overnight
Hydrix.
to the settlement of Barcelona, fighting the entire time. Had he dropped dead of a heart attack the moment they made it to safety, he'd now be remembered as a balls-out warrior instead of a spectacular and ballsy con man. Mine is too obvious now that the guys have chosen it. But what was that battle? What was that battle where Napoleon is just—he's like 26 years old or something. He's fucking leading the French army.
How long
And
does
he's
this
just like,
last?
they don't want to attack. I can't remember the details. There's some force, there's a bridge, and he's like, "F it, I'll lead them." And he grabs that French flag and he just fucking runs for it.
and he ends up thrown in
That's
the
pretty
river
neat.
and then spewed out and something like that. But yeah, Napoleon kind of a badass. Finally, Daniel
Okay.
Green 6194 asks, what's your favorite pancake toppings? Evan says classic New Englander here. The answer is obviously maple syrup. Evan.
The United States is conducting a ton of clandestine missions in the South China Sea that we never hear about. From covert operations against China to building alliances and fighting terrorists.
Man, I ain't
Today,
doing that. I'm
we're
just
putting
using
together
supernatural Nancy
declassified
pages, man.
CIA
I'm not wasting
documents
overload.
and personal accounts to do a deep dive on the legitimately insane American black ops across
Understandable.
the Pacific. First, we need to know about the guys pulling these missions off. America's first Special Forces group is the team responsible for missions in this just gigantic hog of an area of operations. I mean, it covers everything from India to China, down through Southeast Asia and across the island chains to the U.S. Pacific coastline. This region spans across over 1,000
let's hear
different
it.
languages, the world's three
Figure,
largest
let's
economies, biggest
do
armies,
some
36
combat
different
with
countries,
this,
16
and then we're
time zones,
gonna
and 50% of the world's
do
population
this, do that,
and
and
Earth's
do this,
surface.
do
Behind
that.
these cold hard numbers, though,
This
are
and
some of
that.
the most beautiful views and ancient cultures that brought us things my viewers love the
Super
most,
neat.
like
Super.
gunpowder and anime.
It's about 5,000 miles from San Francisco to Okinawa, so to cut down on response time, they have an entire battalion of operators already forward deployed year-round here at Torii Station. In addition to that, SF Detachment 39 is forward deployed here in Songam, Korea. What's on First Group's to-do list? 5 out of their 7 mutual defense treaty allies are located here in the Pacific, which means if one of these nations are attacked, the United States is required to respond with just an offensive amount of ordnance. America and China have long been suspicious of one another's intentions and have tried some creative ways of determining what they're really up to. In September 2008, 4 men were hired as crew transporting a 40-foot yacht to a businessman in Japan who had bought the vessel. Sounds routine, right? But of course, none of that was true. Despite all the receipts and bills of sale on board as proof of their cover story, the vessel was actually owned and operated by a CIA shell company, and the 4 crew members were actually from the CIA's Special Activities Center Maritime Branch. They were sent out from their safe house in Malaysia. Their target for the mission was a small island off the coast of Luzon in the northern Philippines. This was close to a ring of artificial islands that the Chinese military had been constructing in this contested territory that the United States and its allies wanted to keep an eye on. But things got complicated very quickly.
But before we get into that,
Gentlemen, new wallet sponsor. What do you think? Whoa, very nice. Look at that. Picked it up from Extra yesterday. Smooth, sleek design, expandable backplate for extra cards, and with one push of the button, my God, Cappy, a quick access card ejector mechanism. Nice coloring. Yeah, that's green ore. And the material's something called 6061 T6 space grade aluminum. But what happens if you lose it? There's a finder card in here. Slips right in, syncs with my phone, and I can track it anywhere. Yeah, but does it have a ton of gas station receipts in it like my wallet? Well, let's see Paul Allen's
Oh,
wallet.
for fuck's sake.
Look at that subtle leather workmanship, handcrafted Italian vachetta. Notice the smooth glide of the metal trigger. 14 cards rising up. Beneath it all, an RFID layer protecting against thieves' cyber intrusions. My God, it even has a lifetime warranty.
the Extra Travel Vacuum Kit is perfect for me. This saves me 60% space in any bag. Right now, Extra's offering up to 48% off, and if you use my code CAPPY, you get an extra 10% off. Just click the link in the description or the pinned comment below.
Using commercial scuba gear, 2 of the crew would dive off the boat, swim unseen to the island, and plant a pod full of advanced, highly classified surveillance devices along the shoreline. The expertise of the 4 CIA operatives reveal a lot. Steven Sinek was a former Navy explosives expert. Michael Perch was an expert diver. James McCormick was a marine engineer, and Daniel Meeks would provide operational support for the whole mission. To avoid drawing attention from the Chinese military, the pod was disguised to look like a rock and used only passive electronic listening devices that would not emit any kind of traceable signal. Even if the yacht was stopped and searched by the Chinese Navy, no one would think to question some innocent old scuba divers trying to enjoy the tropic scenery. The plan was to let the pod snoop around for a week or two, then the CIA crew would return from Japan to pick it back up and send the data back to headquarters. On the surface, a very simple drop-off and pick-up mission. Unfortunately for the team, Tropical Storm Higos was forming in the Western Pacific, and it threatened to pass through the area. A 40-foot commercial yacht just isn't built to handle those kind of conditions. The team had a very difficult choice to make, whether or not to scrub the mission before departing Malaysia. The team decided to go for it ultimately.
Would
But
y'all
the
be
Storm
interested
kept its
in doing
constant
next
course over the
today?
Philippines and barreled straight for
Indeed.
the operational
In-
area.
indeed-
There
indeed.
was no time to turn around.
Indeed or
Officers back home in
Indeed,
HQ
indeed.
in
What
Langley
do you mean?
listened as the team
Nigga,
reported
I don't give
severe
a
storm
fuck about
conditions
none
over
of
the
this,
radio,
bro. Tell me how to
and
use
watched
this
in
boat,
horror
bro.
as the eye of the storm passed directly over the vessel's tracking beacon. Then the beacon went dark. The U.S. government couldn't even mobilize any U.S. military assets in the area because they feared
Like-
blowing the mission's cover. Japanese defense forces did search for them, but they never found
Welcome back.
anything. The team was officially declared
Looks
lost
like
at
you're
sea a few months later.
starting
One of the
another
officers, Fenix
quest.
dive buddies, said, quote,
Only
"We knew better
starting.
than to ask questions." Another officer pinned the blame for the fatalities on then Special Activities
Oh my
Center
God.
Chief.
Oh.
There were a lot of
Hold on,
pressures
please
to do
don't tell me
ops.
it's two
They
raw
just didn't
chompies I
have to
need.
die. They did a mission they
'Cause I
didn't
just
have
got
to
two
do.
chompies for free.
The 4 officers' stars were later added
Damn
to
it,
the
it do-
memorial
they do have to
wall
be raw.
at the CIA headquarters. This mission was barely talked about in the media. The U.S. Special Forces preparations against China have also gone largely unnoticed. First Group has had to evolve from a counter-terror organization to developing
So I
a
actually
plan to
cannot
counter a
use a
Chinese
comp.
invasion
Is it
in
ogre
Taiwan.
bow? I have
And
to use
here's
a
one
regular
new
ogre bow,
declassified
which
way
means I'm
they
gonna have to
plan
make
to
one
do
myself.
it. It's 1800 hours at Kadena Air
Oh,
Base
boy.
in Okinawa, Japan. A U.S. Army Special Forces ODA is kitted up standing in the belly of a C-130. Their mission? Get on to T2 Island. It's a speck of
Where's
land in the
Rand? I'll
South
just go
China
buy one from
Sea,
him. I'm not trying
held
to
by the
fucking make that
Philippines,
shit.
sitting just 30 kilometers away from Chinese-occupied Subu Reef. It's one of the islands most likely to be contested in the event of a Chinese war with Taiwan.
Maybe you could walk me through. It sounds like it's like a joint forcible entry.
Eastern
It's
part
getting
of
on
the Felda
island.
Hills area.
What are some of the challenges?
We actually,
oh, for
with
fuck's sake,
First
he's all
ODA,
over there. I
that
remember.
concept a military freefall
All
operation
right, let's go.
into an island in the South China Sea. The idea behind this was that you could have operators essentially hey-ho in from 20, 30, 40 miles outside of these islands, hit the islands, and then that way be able to guide in Marine HIMARS units.
The C-130 takes off under radio silence, hugs the sea at low altitude for the first leg of the flight to stay under radar coverage. Total flight time
This is
just
a
under
fucking
4
fetch
hours.
quest,
The
holy
aircraft
mogolley.
stays offshore, avoiding the island's known air defense threat
Oh, fuck
rings.
off.
The team exits over the
Do I have to
ocean,
do a quest for the,
free-falling silently through the night sky. At 4,000 feet, they pull their chutes. It's a wet drop
prayers
5
for
kilometers off the
necromancy?
shore, if you know what I mean.
I think some of them are
Designated
quest
small
blocked, yeah.
combat boat that was already pre-positioned by Allied Filipino forces just 2 hours
'Cause it looks
earlier.
like the sap
Everything timed
and
down to
stuff
the minute,
require
with CD levels of accuracy for the ODA team.
Yo, Rance, I need another
Within
boat,
2
bro.
hours,
Don't be
the
a
Green
bitch.
Berets have set up a secure perimeter and
Thanks.
cleared a sexy landing strip. A HIMARS
Alright, now I
battery
need
is
some
flown
balloons.
onto the island. The Green Berets start running ISR with drones, sending target information
Fuck
to
these
the
stupid
HIMARS
chompies.
launchers. They're painting
Make
targets
sure you kill
like
them in the
Chinese
cauldrons.
radar arrays on Subi Reef.
Huh?
Make sure I
Bringing
what?
those
In the
HIMARS
in the
units
cauldrons.
with help through us
Oh,
actually
can I
taking
not
the
do it out in the
islands
general
initially,
area?
and then be able to sort of island hop our way through the South
I mean, I
China
don't
Sea
know
and
if that's,
these
but I
tiny
would
islands,
feel like
bringing that
I
sort of
wouldn't test
HIMARS
my luck.
feasibility
Be
forward
like, oh.
that allows them to then
Oh.
Just do it in the.
attack
Oh,
China.
yeah.
But
I
can
think it
talk
does have
about
to be
that
in their
because,
encampment.
I mean, we broadcasted it huge so that China would see it specifically, and sometimes
Oh,
that
whoops.
You need
Oh,
70
yeah,
range.
where we want, our adversaries to know.
What's your range level? 60?
The
No, usually
launchers
10
fire
levels are
and
fine.
load back up into a C-130, and they're
what the
gone
fuck?
from the
Where can I-
island before
Okay,
they can be fixed
right
by
here.
Chinese counterbat. But it's
Oh, wait, no,
not
no, no, no,
all
wait, that doesn't work.
explosives.
I
The
have
United
to
States and China are also waging a quieter
fill
war
these
against one another.
first.
You may never have heard of the Special Collections Service. They sound
Right,
innocently like
okay.
a subdivision of the U.S. Postal Service. In reality, they're a highly classified joint operation between the CIA and the NSA. It's a beautiful,
Okay.
unholy alliance
And now
formed
we
and
hunt
cooked in the depths
two
of
zombies.
intelligence hell. This isn't even acknowledged officially. It's codenamed F6. and it wasn't really fully confirmed until Edward Snowden leaked its existence. Their whole job is to get eavesdropping equipment into impossible places like embassies, foreign governments, and offices. They're like burglars.
What
that
a
are
name.
Bankrolled by a government with a blank check.
What name?
They've been called the Mission Impossible team of the
Femboy
United
feet.
States.
What the
It's
fuck?
just
Wait, what? Femboy feet?
That's what his name is.
What a name.
Interesting.
And in early 2000, China placed an order for a 767 Boeing aircraft because in 2000 they didn't know
The
any
fuck
better.
are the
By
Trumpies at,
2002,
man?
the aircraft was being fitted in
I
San
don't know.
Antonio, Texas.
Longer.
The maintenance had
That's fucked
started
up.
a
I
year
need 'em
prior.
back.
It was all routine.
Nah.
What wasn't routine
Oh
was it
my
was being
God.
done under the close watch of heavily armed Chinese security guards. Why? Because the plane was like the Air Force One for then Chinese President Jiang Zemin. It was only a few days before the plane was scheduled to shuttle Mr. Xing to the Asia-Pacific Economic Forum in Shanghai,
I
where
got
the
a
two heads
single
of state,
Trumpy.
America and China, would be meeting. Chinese technicians reportedly found something odd when they were running routine tests before the journey. There was a kind of static whine coming from several devices. Inside the plane, a surveillance
Okay,
bug was
looks
found
like we're
in
gonna
his
have
private
to
bathroom
blow
on
up
the
another
jet, and
frog.
another was found above the bed in his plane's presidential suite. I had no idea the CIA was naughty like that, wanting to know what the Chinese president's dirty talk was
Screw
like.
this.
The plane was brought to a military airfield north of Beijing.
We
while
are
their
going
investigators
to
looked into how this breach
Edville.
of Chinese security
And I'm
happened.
gonna go to the abyss.
The operation fit the bill for the kind of mission that the Special
To the
Collection
abyss.
Service is
The
responsible
great
for.
abyss.
The CIA bribed or blackmailed one of the Chinese
luck, good
security agents. Then the NSA provided the device, which was then reportedly operated via a satellite connection. And that's who planted the bug, most likely. One of these
For my
Chinese
training points for
defectors.
necromancy,
This is
what would I
something
want to
that
go
could
for? The
never
ghost,
happen
where it
today
makes me
under
more
this
tanky, or like it
geopolitical
heals me or
climate.
some shit?
The two
I don't know
nations
what
would
the
just
fuck- I don't know if
never
the ghost
be
really does,
exchanging
but
sensitive aircraft
I
like
don't
one of those.
know what
In
you
fact,
should
the
go
two
for, to
countries
be
are
honest.
so completely closed off to one another that they're resorting to YouTube to send messages.
don't want to
Did
go
you
for
know the
threads
CIA
because I
has
do
an
not want to make
official
more
YouTube
runes.
channel?
Fuck
No.
that.
I already asked, they denied my request to become their
Hell no,
influencer.
dude.
Starting in 2024, in a bold and really shocking move, they started
Let's see
releasing
here.
a series of
Do we even have
Chinese
enough
language
points?
videos onto their YouTube channel. Look at how sleek and
No,
high
how many points
production
do I
value
have?
they
How close
are.
are away from me
A
to see
whole
this?
crew put millions of dollars into producing this CIA video. They hired entire crews and lighting teams and everything from Hollywood.
I think
They're
I need an
clearly
extra active
designed to
log.
appeal to high-profile Chinese business owners, government officials, or military generals who have got a bone to pick with their government.
Bro, I
Someone
do
who's
not give a fuck
disillusioned
about
by the
that chompy
CCP.
over there, bro.
Maybe
Get that fuck
someone
nigga
who-
off my
one of their
screen.
buddies was black-bagged and put into prison in Xi for
Alright.
political crimes or something like that. These
Let's
videos are fully narrated in Mandarin
south.
to appeal to that audience.
West.
It gets weirder. The CIA even gives you instructions in the video on how to access this secure site on the dark web where you can reveal information
Man, I
about
hate
China
fucking
to them. This
necromancy.
way you won't have to worry about big Chinese brother finding out that
Kid,
you're whispering sweet
you
nothings
gotta do
into
all
the
this
CIA
extra shit
ear.
for
The campaign
what?
reportedly generated
I
tens
just
of
want the
thousands
freaking
of hits
shit,
within
man.
just weeks. So apparently,
Wait,
if
why
you
did I
want
come
someone
here?
in the
I'm
agency
fucking
to
retarded.
read your message, you can send it there, and all
Me
the
and you
CIA
both.
interns will dig through it.
There's another part of the way the CIA organization is laid out where there's the political action.
When it comes to psyops or political influence covert action, it's picking the right people with the right
I
experience.
should go
that can
and
really
get Leech
know the
before
differences
teleporting here.
of how people think and what motivates
Leech
them.
and
We need to be way
necromancy.
more savvy when it comes to how we help shape the psychological and influence battle space.
China's
Which I
own
can get that
Ministry
from
of State
somewhere.
Security, the MSS,
Not sure
has
where, but
launched
somewhere.
counter campaigns, warning their people of the consequences
you?
of betraying their country. The former CIA director Bill Burns told the Financial Times in 2025 that 20% of their entire budget is now devoted to stopping Chinese spies and in turn spying on China. Pacific stonk going up. But what if I told you these two spy agencies, the United States, China, CIA, MSS, have actually worked closely together on the same team in the past? Like those episodes where Batman and the Joker had to team up to defeat something even more evil and more communist. In 1980, the CIA pulled off one of the strangest ops of the Cold War. It built a multi-million-dollar spy station inside communist China. This was done in full cooperation and authorization of Beijing. Now, why would they agree to something like that? Because back then, China hated Moscow almost as much as Washington did. After 1969 border clashes where hundreds of Chinese and Soviet troops were killed, Chinese president at the time, Xiaoping, was happy to take American tech if it meant keeping an eye on his old frenemy. The goal was high priority, to eavesdrop on the Soviet Union's most sensitive missile tests, ICBM tests,
What you want
and
me to
troop
do?
movements
Uh-uh.
from right across their border. They picked
What?
the western region of Xinjiang, was perfectly
Huh?
line of sight to Soviet
Huh?
launch ranges in Kazakhstan. The project is codenamed Chestnut, costing the United
Fuck
States
no, I
an
ain't
estimated
doing
$90
that.
million over its life. Pulled
How about
from
you give me the other
black
one?
budget, of
Sap
course. That covered
necromancy.
the
You wanna sap them
C-141
from their
flights,
energy.
hauling in 50 tons of NSA intercept equipment, 2 massive parabolic dish arrays, and a secure
Cool.
fiber link back to
What?
U.S. analysts. Inside, about 20 American
You
specialists
didn't give it to me.
rotated with 40 PLA
Lady.
signals officers. Together, they vacuumed up tons of raw data on Soviet missiles, radio chatter, and troop movements. The partnership ran even deeper, though. It would be like if the Rebel Alliance teamed up with the Empire and decided to rule the galaxy together. In the book What We Won, America's Secret War in Afghanistan, they detail how Brzezinski from the U.S. State Department went to China
Maybe this isn't
and
any
asked them to
faster.
work
This is
together
actually
with
definitely
the United
slower.
States to send weapons to the Mujahideen to fight against the
The next
Soviets
spot.
in Afghanistan. China agreed
Yo.
to do it on the down low, as long as the U.S. pinky
Oh.
promised not to tell anyone about their secret relationship. China sent
Cool.
300 advisors to train
Where's
the
my
militia
cannon?
across the border in Pakistan, and they sent over $400 million.
One of
worth
these
of
places
weaponry,
is
which
bound
was a
to be
lot back
faster.
then. The weapons they sent were nearly identical
No
to
one
what the
would do it.
Russians were using, so they kept a level of plausible deniability, and much of this didn't come out until years later. Then, in June 1989, after the Tiananmen
So if you do
Square
sap
killings,
necromancy, does that
relations
increase
iced
your
over between
damage?
the spy
I'm
agencies
not
of the
sure
United
it
States
does.
and China, and those spy
Because it says drain
stations were
enemy
destroyed, and this
necromancy.
kind
So
of
do they have to be
cooperation
using
wouldn't happen
necromancy
again.
for my
And
necromancy to
just
go up?
mentioning this means that this video will get blacklisted.
Damn
The
it.
entire
They
American
made it sound
Special
like if I
Forces and
completed this
CIA
part of the quest, I'd be able to
actually
buy
has
the
its
food. I'm
origins
not doing
right
the whole
here in
quest
the
right now.
Pacific. You see, during
Okay.
World War II, the U.S.
That's
fought
fine.
across here against the Japanese Empire when they were going absolutely buck wild.
I will
But
be
what a lot of
right
people
back,
don't
ladies and
know
gentlemen.
is
I
that
am
at
gonna
the
go put
same
my food in the
time,
microwave.
US was covertly
and
funneling
then,
billions of dollars
we're gonna
worth of
eat and then
aid
get our
and
Zucchini.
weapon systems to China to keep
While
their
I
fight
eat, I guess
alive.
I'll craft.
Which is nuts, because supplying China with weapons today would be considered cray-cray. And the United States didn't just
Crafting
stop working
away.
with their allies in the region after that and say, see you later,
Damn
bye.
it.
No, ever since then, the U.S.
That's
has
fine.
remained deeply involved in security.
I had no
Dave
idea that
King.
American SF were going to Mongolia and chilling there and hanging there.
It's recent. I was one of the first ODAs there in 2019. We just
I'm gonna
recently
wiki
started
this
to work
while
on that.
I
They really like America. It looks like I'm sure you've seen in Ukraine, in the sort of that old Soviet bloc, the way everything's built.
Yeah.
It looks like Ukraine, or it looks like Russia there. Everything is like Russian
Leech
structured. They
necromancy.
send all of their
Increase your
military
necromancy.
officers to
2%
Russia.
chance successful.
So they love Russia. Which is so weird. They love Russia. They love the United States. They're cordial with North Korea.
Oh, so it
they
is
don't
good.
like China. So
It is good. It is
super
really
cool
good.
and interesting place.
What is the Special Forces operator's strategy here? U.S. trade is worth more than $3 trillion here, making the trade routes in the Pacific a core interest to the United States. American Special Forces work closely with the nations here from their perspective to defend their sovereignty, and they do it at the invitation of the governments, who see U.S. support as a deterrent. The Philippines, Taiwan, Mongolia, Australia, Thailand, Japan, and South Korea are just a few of the close allies, and often it's American operators on the ground who help keep these international diplomatic relations warm. But the Chinese Communist Party see it very differently than the international community. They argue that it's always been Chinese sovereignty in this area for centuries, but Washington frames its presence as keeping sea lanes open to anyone who wants to ride. It's always the small disagreements that can lead to thermonuclear war, isn't it?
And I got to be a little bit more careful about talking about this in Taiwan, because, we are there. The Special Forces units have been for a long time. We're sort of embedded there in developing sort of all the backside unconventional warfare. If China were to actually try to invade the island, we go in.
I've returned.
Work by, with, and through, train,
I
advise,
found out it does work.
nation's military.
It works just like
That's
curses.
essentially what we're doing with the
Nice.
Special forces.
So
It's
yeah, you
not
just
all the
don't
US
use
versus China, though.
sap,
These
use
black
leech.
ops happened over 500 miles south of
okay, I
mainland
see.
China. The details of how First Group got caught up in multiple firefights in Asia are now only just coming to light many years later. Starting in 2001, U.S. Special Forces were deployed to the Philippines to help against Islamic terrorists. The Filipino government had a massive terror problem on their hands, trying to overthrow their government in the south. By 2009, there were 600 U.S. military personnel advising and assisting the armed forces of the Philippines against terrorists. We now know there were a bunch of incidents of firefights of U.S. advisors getting caught in ambushes and engaging enemy here. In fact, by 2014, the CIA was sending in its paramilitary officers to straight up murk terrorist leaders willy-nilly.
You want to talk about the Philippines? I mean, the Philippines, like, First Group was actively in combat in southern Philippines in places like Mindanao for like 20 years during the global war on terror that nobody knew, because in no wards you couldn't get a CIB, but like First Group dudes were down there fighting all the time because there's a huge terrorism problem from the southern Philippines down through Malaysia. I think, and most of it comes up through Malaysia. So a lot of people don't understand Malaysia is what, 95% Islamic. And so a lot of that, ISIS, spread of ISIS and Islamic terrorist groups moved its way up through Indonesia and into the southern Philippines.
Combat operations continued until 2017 at the Battle of Marla, which was kind of the last climactic battle here. After that, terrorist groups' presence had been seriously degraded in the Philippines. All told, 3 U.S. personnel died in the fighting. The major takeaway here, though, is that it ended up being an outstanding reason for the U.S. to get closer with the Philippines government and develop a kind of cozy relationship. This buddy-buddy relationship has now bloomed and come in handy years later, as it's become one of the main allies and key logistics hubs for U.S. troops in the region in their goal to deter war with China.
It's a super sensitive country because they're trying to keep peaceful ties and good business relationships with China and the United States.
Is that not
having
a
American
task?
special forces
To
and
put the magic
military,
shield
that's
on
a
her
very
or did
tight
it?
alliance that China is not
magic
gonna be
short
happy
bow.
with. Like, they don't want to hear that there's U.S. soldiers doing combat operations on their doorstep.
That might sound
What?
insane, thinking about a war happening today between
can get one
these
from,
two giants. But a lot of people forget that the
The
U.S.
hard-
already fought
they
a
drop
war with China
magic
in Korea.
short
At the
bows.
time, the CIA cooked up a wild
I
attempt
don't know where
to
I got
take
my
the
shield bow
pressure
from,
off
to be
American
honest.
forces who were fighting against the Chinese in Korea. America had worked alongside the Kuomintang
Is this
inside
one
China
one of them?
since all the way
That
back
one's
in
not one
World War
either.
II. It was a large Chinese civil war that was happening between these factions. So they sent billions of dollars of weapons and aid to the Kuomintang to fight the Japanese. During World War II, the precursor of the CIA was responsible for setting up what was called the Burma Section, or Detachment 101 of the OSS. Detachment 101 was the first American unit ever assembled to conduct guerrilla warfare, espionage, and sabotage behind enemy lines. Their mission was to reopen the Burma Road and send billions of dollars in weapons and supplies to China. Ever since the Kuomintang lost control of China and had to fall back to Taiwan after the war, they've been searching for ways to retake mainland China from the communist government. The tables were turned back then. They suggested to the U.S. government that they had a loyal following of 1 million fighters in the mainland, just waiting for them to rise up if they had United States backing. The source of their intelligence was hard to argue with. They got it straight from Trust Me, Bro. The Pentagon was skeptical, but they put together ammo to arm 200K fighters anyways. The plan was to train, arm, and coordinate anti-communists within China. It was called the Third Force. By 1952, CIA planes from their civil air transport were dropping thousands of Kuomintang fighters that were personally trained by them across the mainland. But the initial drops failed, and they were all killed or captured. That's when 2 young CIA paramilitary officers joined the Third Force program, John Downey and Richard Bechtold. This second team...
Alright, boys,
indigenous
BRB. Let me go grab my
airdropped
food.
into
Just gonna
northern
eat a
China
little bit
sometime
real
in
quick
mid-July
and
of
then go get a
1952.
Zaki.
This time it went swimmingly. In November, that team radioed back to base to CIA that they made a big break. They'd made contact with a local guerrilla leader who had captured documents with valuable intelligence. Sounds dope. Things were looking up for a change. The CIA field office arranged an immediate airdrop of the material. The way the CIA exfiltrated personnel was actually kind of crazy. It was called a snatch pickup, which was kind of similar to the Fulton Skyhook method that you've probably seen in the Metal Gear games. Now, Downey and Fecteau boarded a C-47 cargo plane and took off on a secret mission into hostile airspace. As the C-47 dropped low and lined up for the snatch, then the trap was sprung. Unknown to them, their team on the ground that they'd been communicating with had been compromised. At some point in their mission, communist security forces had captured their team and turned them into double agents working for the communists. The whole thing was a lie, just to bait and lure the CIA in for the kill. Communist forces threw the tarps off their two hidden anti-aircraft guns and opened fire. The guns tore into the plane from both sides, igniting the fuel tanks. The shot-up C-47 broke into two on impact, throwing Downey and Fecteau against the forward bulkhead. The two pilots were killed instantly. Chinese forces were on the downed aircraft within minutes, capturing the surviving American intelligence officers. They were subjugated to endless interrogations, complete with physical and mental abuse. They were held captive for decades before being released in the 1970s when relations between the two nations finally warmed. This wasn't the only time the CIA attempted to extract a valuable person from Chinese-occupied territory. The Himalayan country of Tibet had a long and conflicted history as both an independent nation and as part of China. Tibet attempted to assert its independence from China in the 1950s. They were a deeply religious nation. The Dalai Lama served as both a political and spiritual leader for Tibet. The 14th Dalai Lama had just turned 15 years old and attempted to negotiate with China for their independence. It was going to be peacefully with the People's Republic of China, but Chinese forces weren't having it. They crossed into Tibet in early October 1950, and Tibetan forces in the border region of Chambo were swept aside. The Tibetan government had no choice but to sign China's pre-drafted peace terms. The Dalai Lama chose not to flee the country. As PLA forces marched into the Tibetan capital, the communist government cracked down on religious expression, destroying Buddhist monasteries in eastern Tibet, and a resistance formed against them. The Dalai Lama's brother, who had fled to India, reached out to the U.S. government for support. The U.S. agreed to support the Tibetan rebels through a new CIA program, training and arming Tibetan volunteers outside the country before inserting them back into Tibet. It was called Street Circus, and the CIA program brought over 200 Tibetan resistance fighters to Camp Hale in Colorado for training and advanced operation and intelligence gathering techniques. Once they parachuted back in country, the teams raided PLA positions and kept in constant contact with their CIA handlers through covert radio transceivers. American cargo planes that had cover stories that they were just civilian cargo planes dropped arms and supplies to the resistance, supporting the covert agents through much of the South. CIA Director of Operations for Tibet, John Kenneth Knaus, ran these missions. The CIA officers came up with a way to sneak the Dalai Lama through the Chinese military lines. The officers disguised the Dalai Lama as a Chinese soldier and snuck him out of a side exit from the palace. Once out of the city, the group linked up with the American radio team and headed south together towards resistance-held territory. Dodging military patrols and making their way through the rough terrain, the radio team updated Langley with their location every 24 hours, helping U.S. headquarters track their progress. After a tense 19 days, the Dalai Lama and his CIA escorts reached friendly territory and crossed over into neighboring India. As the news of the Dalai Lama's successful escape reached the people of Tibet, tens of thousands of refugees followed in his wake, making the journey through the mountain passes and into northern India. Among the community living in exile were many young men eager to continue the fight against Chinese occupation of their homeland. A new resistance base was established in the remote Mustang district of Nepal, right on the Tibetan border. From here, CIA trained and supplied resistance fighters and raided the Xinjiang-Tibet Highway, the Chinese military's main supply route into Tibet. During one of these raids, Tibetan fighters recovered a messenger bag full of official documents describing the hardship, famine, and unrest within the Chinese homeland as a result of the communist government's ill-fated Great Leap Forward project. The fighters immediately
Two more crafting levels, and then we can go start ours at Cape.
Which turned out to be one of the most important pieces of intelligence of the 1960s. Until then, the CIA had failed to penetrate the Chinese government or gain much meaningful intelligence of the Chinese domestic situation. These documents were the first real insight into the internal dynamics of the Chinese party and some of the biggest problems facing the party. The Great Leap Forward was this momentous political, social, and economic project that aimed to restructure all of Chinese society around hardline communist ideals of progress. But the forceful uprooting of China's agricultural economy resulted in the second largest famine in recorded history, with somewhere between 15 and 55 million Chinese citizens dying of starvation. If it weren't for the CIA's help in Tibet, the rest of the world may never have known just how bad things were in mainland China in the early 1960s. At the end of the day, these stories show that the shadow war between America and China didn't start yesterday. This shift has been going on for generations, moving from jungles and mountainous terrain to coral reefs and YouTube feeds. Friends change, alliances shift, enemies become frenemies, and the chessboard is never static. But the game has always been the same. Stay a step ahead, get the intelligence first, and shape the battlefield before the shooting even starts.
They can invade and take Taiwan. There's no doubt in my mind. If they really want to go scorched earth, they're not going to be stopped. But that entails killing millions and millions and millions of ethnically Chinese. That is also culturally in mainland China not acceptable. But then what do they take? You're the ruler over bones and ash? Is that strategically and culturally what the reunification of China and Taiwan is supposed to look like for Xi Jinping? No.
And listening to the full hour-long interviews that I did, those are on the YouTube members only section. There's exclusive content. If you want, you can go to cappyarmy.com for merch and show notes and sources for this episode. Also, be sure to show some love to our head creative producer and editor, Mike Michaelides, for his outstanding work on this video. Ending transmission now. The Monroe Doctrine looks like it's still alive and well, as the U.S. military deployed a fleet of warships and Marines surrounding the coast of Venezuela. The Pentagon's official messaging is that it's a mission to combat the drug cartels, but Venezuela's President Maduro says it's actually just a pretense for the U.S. to pull off a regime change against him. We'll see how this is actually just the most recent spat in a decades-long string of escalations between these two nations. These two have gone from being best bros to being on this collision course in a relatively short period of time. The buildup of American firepower in the Caribbean is the largest in over a generation, with at least a nuclear attack submarine, 3 guided missile destroyers, and multiple landing ships carrying over 4,500 sailors and Marines. And if you've ever seen how boring it gets out at sea on a Mew, these guys are begging the cartel to do something. And do something they did, because the strike group fired their first shots at the Venezuelan cartel, blowing up a smuggling boat, killing 11 alleged Tren de Aragua cartel members in a gigantic fireball. Instead of capturing and questioning these guys like they would have with the Coast Guard's help normally in the past, the military is now shooting first and asking questions never. Venezuela's armed forces responded by deploying their own warships armed with Chinese anti-ship missiles and long-range Iranian-designed drones off the coast. Maduro scrambled 2 of his F-16 fighter jets that he'd ordered to buzz American destroyers at low altitude. How did he get those? What's really happening here is Venezuela and the US are acting out a much older geopolitical drama that has its roots in the Monroe Doctrine over 200 years ago. And the story of how these two nations went from being best friends to worst adversaries helps explain what we're going to see next. Is this a ramp up to a US invasion, an attempt at regime change, or saber rattling? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Let's find out. Today's episode is sponsored by Ground News. We'll use their website to analyze this story about if the United States will strike Mexican cartels on their territory. It gives me the fast facts right up on top from over 400 different outlets. Ground News goes ahead and tells me which of the 10% of the sources are state-funded, which means they're getting paid by the government, which is something I need to know if they're possibly a straight-up mouthpiece of a nation. And these are just some patterns that you start to notice when you play around with the app as a tool. Some US outlets frame the story as routine clarification. Outlets in Mexico, however, warn that it shows growing mistrust between allies. Ground News lays all this out on their bias map, so I can see how each side is spinning the story. That's why Ground News has become my go-to tool for cutting through disinformation and misinformation. And because I believe in it so much, they're offering you guys 40% understanding of the world. Give Ground News a shot. To understand why these U.S. warships are parked off Venezuela's coast, we have to start with its geopolitical importance. So Venezuela sits at one of the most strategic pieces of real estate in the Western Hemisphere, right near the vital shipping lanes to the Panama Canal. And beneath it all, they have the world's largest proven oil reserves, although it's heavy oil that's harder to refine. Venezuela is only about 1,000 miles away from Florida. Its close proximity and socialist ways are why it's being called the new Cuba of the Second Cold War. And as with all sequels, it's much bigger, with a population of 30 million people and a gigantic 350,000 square miles of territory. Its topography is made of dense jungles and mountains, which would make an invasion a real pain.
Venezuela, that was some mean bush.
They have over 500,000 combined active duty and reservists, a modern arsenal of Russian main battle tanks, fighter jets, and Iranian kamikaze drones within striking distance of America. But the irony is that not so long ago, this same geography made Venezuela America's strongest ally in all of Latin America. So what went so very wrong? Dictator Juan Gomez seizes power in 1908 and decides to open the doors wide up to U.S. oil companies. America has the industrial know-how to develop his nation's untapped oil fields. Within just a generation, the U.S.-Venezuela partnership transforms the nation into the largest petroleum exporter in Latin America. It's a win-win. With their 50-50 split of profits, that makes the country flush with guap. They've got cold hard cash, and it's just in time for World War II. Venezuela fuels the Allied war machine. They provide 50% of all U.S. oil imports, becoming their single largest oil supplier. This is a huge strategic win for America because it only takes 3 days to ship oil from Venezuela compared to the 30 days that it takes to get oil in from the Middle East. The U.S. sends dozens of Sherman tanks and fighter aircraft as a sign of affection, but the military bromance between the two nations is just beginning to blossom because in 1947, the two countries join what's called the Rio Pact. It commits them to helping each other defend the Western Hemisphere against any outside attack like, communism. The Rio Pact is a lot like NATO, but for the Americas instead of Europe. It even has an Article 3 clause that states an attack on one is attack on all. At its height, everybody who's anybody in the Western Hemisphere is part of the Rio Pact. It's now the 1950s, and Venezuela tosses aside its form of dictatorship and authoritarian rule. They become a stable democracy with elections and all that good stuff. This puts them in even closer alignment with the United States government. In fact, Venezuela's friendship allows it to avoid all those brutal coups and military interventions that the U.S. conducts throughout Latin America in the Cold War. And this is only the beginning. These two nations' relations are on fire in the best way. Because in 1973, the Arab oil countries withhold oil from the United States. Venezuela steps in and helps out to reliably supply oil to America throughout that embargo. And things could not possibly get any better. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Then, in 1976, things start to shift. Venezuela nationalizes the oil industry, which ends direct U.S. corporate control of its oil fields. So overnight, Exxon's forced to hand over control to the new Venezuelan state-owned oil company. Now the relationship has started to shift, because the United States is simply buying the oil from Venezuela instead of owning it, which means future Venezuelan leaders could use oil as a political weapon against Washington. But that was a problem to worry about in the future. All relations have their ups and downs, and for now, relations are reaching an all-time high. It's the 1980s, and Venezuela just signed the Peace Delta program. It allows them to receive 24 of the advanced American F-16 fighter jets, so that's where they got them. They're actually the only Latin American country to be granted this powerful capability directly. American armored vehicles, European fighter jets, and a whole fleet of modern naval frigates start flowing in. Venezuela was looking like a full-on petro-state democracy. But underneath the boom, the resource curse is about to show its ugly head. The resource curse is the fact that Venezuela is 95% dependent on oil for revenue. This is a major risk. It's a huge liability because in the mid-1980s, the price of oil collapses from $30 a barrel to under $10 a barrel. This wipes out government revenue overnight, and Venezuela's turned to the Western-led institution, the IMF, for help.
Got my
The
KPs,
IMF
got
is
my
sort of like a payday loan company, but for countries. The $4.5 billion bailout comes with strict strings attached. This money comes with austerity measures, which means they have to cut back drastically on government spending. So if you're a citizen living in Venezuela, all you see is overnight the cost to fill up your gas tank rises by 100%. Many people lose their jobs, and social programs that people rely on are eliminated. This shock triggers days of riots by the people. The government, in response, deploys the army domestically to restore order. It's a horrible, chaotic scene. The Venezuelan soldiers open fire on crowds of people, and for 3 days, the capital of Caracas looks like a war zone. The brutal crackdown is called the Caracaso Massacre. It's seared into the public consciousness in Venezuela to this day. The effects were devastating. It was similar to like the Great Depression. Among the young officers, though, ordered to deploy during this crackdown against their own people was a paratrooper named Hugo Chavez. He later says he never forgot what he saw, the government turning their rifles on their own citizens. 3 years later, he tries to overthrow the government with a coup. It fails. He's sent to prison. Chavez is later pardoned, and in 1998, he wins the presidency on a promise that he's going to return the nation's oil wealth to the people. Chavez institutes a form of socialism under his slogan of motherland, socialism, or death. Right during this time, a drug trafficking organization called Cartel of the Suns takes form as a network inside Venezuela's military and political elite, starting as low-ranking officers skimming profits off drug shipments that are passing into the United States. But this is where the U.S. relations with Venezuela take a serious turn for the worse. Chavez was openly hostile to the United States from the get-go because from his perspective, Washington had spent decades exploiting Venezuela's oil and toppling left-leaning governments across Latin America. Hugo Chavez says, quote, "The government brought soldiers from the interior like an invading army, as if they were the armed forces of the IMF, but the two nations are still forced to play nice with one another. The U.S. government is still reliant on Venezuela for about a sixth of their oil imports, and Chavez continues selling oil to the United States because he needs that income." But on April 11, 2002, opposition groups stage a massive march in Caracas. Violence erupts, gunfire breaks out, dozens of people are killed with hundreds injured, and top military commanders who had been planning for this for months seize on the chaos, demanding Chavez's resignation. Chavez is arrested by the military, and moments later, the U.S. government, under the Bush administration, quickly recognizes his replacement. But within 48 hours, Chavez is returned to power by loyalists and a public outcry supporting him. The Bush administration claims they had no credible information on the coup plot. However, years later, it's revealed the CIA had actually known weeks in advance. This CIA document here was later declassified, showing intel that they gathered that a coup was about to happen. Whether the CIA was directly involved or just turned a blind eye, either way, Chavez blames the United States for the coup against him. In 2005, the U.S. imposes a full arms embargo on Venezuela, making it impossible for Chavez to get the vital replacement parts that he needs to run his F-16 fighter jets. He turns to buying military equipment from Russia, including T-72 tanks, Su fighter jets, AK-103 rifles, and since 2008, Moscow has flown Tu-160 nuclear-capable long-range strategic bombers into Venezuela, staging them at their military air bases. And Russian warships have docked in Venezuelan ports, and advisors from Russia have trained Venezuelan forces on S-300 air defense systems that they have. Russian soldiers with Wagner patches have been seen on social media helping stop protests there. China builds radar stations monitoring U.S. fighter aircrafts and naval traffic. Well, that all escalated quickly. Venezuela has become the most hostile nation towards the United States in Latin America, but it hasn't fully crossed the line yet between these two. It can still be turned around and salvaged. No one said anything yet that they couldn't take back. Fellas, I can still save her. A month later, Chavez starts using the profits from American-bought oil to subsidize Cuba, Nicaragua, and 12 other nations. The petrocarbide program turns oil into diplomacy. It buys him allies, which in turn buys him votes at the UN. These votes are then used as a block against U.S. projects. U.S. agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy start to fight back. They send millions of dollars in funding to Venezuelan opposition groups and media outlets in an attempt to weaken Chavez's power or outright overthrow him. Chavez makes a move that won't allow that to happen. He abolishes presidential term limits in 2009. The country officially slides back into authoritarian rule. Relations between these two are now worse than estranged. We're in the middle of a full-blown, messy divorce. Son, it's not your fault. Your mother just wants to see other communists. And when Chavez dies in 2013, Nicolas Maduro inherits the state and the hate for America. But it's the worst possible time for Maduro because the shale oil boom inside the United States makes importing oil from Venezuela no longer necessary. The United States becomes a net exporter of oil within a matter of a few short years, and Maduro loses almost all his leverage over the United States almost immediately. Between 2014 and 2016, oil drops from $100 a barrel to $30. This means nearly all of the Venezuelan government's income vanishes. Hyperinflation sets in, and the economy is in freefall. Maduro claims victory in the 2018 election, but international observers and much of the Venezuelan public reject it as fraudulent. The problem is, Maduro doesn't have the je ne sais quoi of Chavez. He doesn't have the popular support and love that Chavez did. And to make up for this, Maduro jails major opposition candidates. They escape into exile as well. And in 2019, Washington indicts Maduro in U.S. courts as a narco drug trafficker and places a $10 million bounty on his head for his arrest. In response, Maduro leans even harder on America's enemies for support. He sells cheap oil to China, invites Iranian Quds Force operatives, which is like their version of the CIA, to establish the largest military drone production facility in all of Latin America on Venezuelan soil, pumping out armed Shahed-style attack drones, the same type that Russia's using against Ukraine. We are on a full-blown collision course now. Gentlemen, with the claims of widely believed fraudulent election in 2020, the U.S. takes even more drastic steps. President Trump institutes sanctions on Venezuela, cutting off what little oil purchases remain, and the economy there goes from bad to worse. The foreign policy goal switches to trying to force regime change by preventing Maduro from being capable of paying his forces. With millions of dollars in bounty money on the table, a group of mercenaries with 2 former U.S. Special Forces operators attempt to land on Venezuelan beaches to capture Maduro and overthrow his government. The plan to exploit what they believe will be thousands of soldiers who will join up against them doesn't pan out. The plan fails almost immediately. Several are killed, and Americans are captured and imprisoned.
Venezuelan authorities killed 8 of the men whom they described as mercenary terrorists.
With smuggling of drugs, gold, and selling cheap oil to China, it means that Maduro has enough to pay his forces for their loyalty, and this rekindles talk of the Monroe Doctrine, a 200-year-old principle that warns rival powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It's originally supposed to be an agreement for the US and Europe to not mess in each other's backyards, but over time it morphs into something much bigger. It becomes a foundational pillar of US dominance in the hemisphere. The strategy believes the US cannot become a great power of the world if it's concerned about adversaries at home, so Washington uses the Monroe Doctrine to justify various bloody interventions like in Panama, coups and occupations across the hemisphere. But in Moscow and Beijing, they claim that the doctrine is really about pushing American imperialism. They claim it's hypocritical because at the same time, the United States stations troops on Russia's border and sails warships through China's coastal waters. America's response to that is they claim it's about defending sovereignty of smaller nations. As Venezuela's economy entirely collapses, 7 million Venezuelan citizens flee the country, many of them to the United States and neighboring countries, causing an immigration crisis across the Americas. Gangs like Tren de Aragua start showing up in U.S. cities, driving discussions about border security and immigration debates. What was once foreign policy has quickly become domestic politics inside the United States. And that's when in 2023, Maduro sees a possible way out of his predicament. He sees a way to claw back all his oil wealth and his position of power domestically. He claims the disputed region from his tiny neighbor Guyana. The recently discovered oil reserves found there can make the much smaller nation of Guyana the world's fastest growing oil producer. Maduro uses this threat of military action as a domestic rallying point. He claims it's to defend sacred Venezuelan territory. He uses this as new leverage to pressure American oil companies that want a piece of that crude oil. Maduro uses the possible invasion as justification to buy more military equipment from the Russians, Iranians, and Chinese. Venezuela deploys troops right to the border of Guyana and begins building new military infrastructure to create a credible threat of an invasion force. Guyana has only 4,000 troops, so they call for backup. The United Kingdom sends a warship to support them, and the U.S. under the Biden administration begins holding joint military drills in solidarity and doing flyovers with fighter jets. They state that they're supporting Guyana's sovereignty, and they increase the reward for Maduro's arrest to $15 million. Now that brings us to today, and the most recent escalation. The U.S. government is once again applying maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela by first increasing that bounty to $50 million for Maduro's capture, and now with sanctions so far failing to create changes in the politics in Venezuela, the U.S. government is turning to an old strategy, also from the 19th century, like the Monroe Doctrine: gunboat diplomacy. They're attempting to use a naval force to pressure Maduro into compliance without outright declaring war. And that's why when you see 7 U.S. warships off Venezuela's coast today, it isn't just about drug cartels, likely. It fits a long pattern of power projection. Today, U.S. naval deployments surrounding Venezuela are too large to simply be to counter drug trafficking. You don't need guided missile destroyers and amphibious landing vehicles to do that. But the strike force is also too small for a full-blown invasion, which would require an aircraft carrier and many times more troops. Instead, the fleet of warships is exactly the right size to project power and put pressure on Maduro by forcing him to pay money, millions of dollars, to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people and equipment and troops, funds that, as we just learned, his nation does not have. It puts his forces into an alert status and forces him to react. He then went on to claim to have mobilized 4.5 million armed citizens and is threatening to call up a full republic in arms, which would be a tremendous sap on his resources. If this pressure were to be sustained, it could lead to a coup against him, or at the least a thorn in his side. This wouldn't be the first time this has been done. In 1964, the U.S. executed Operation Brother Sam by sending an aircraft carrier and destroyers to Brazil in coordination with a coup against their president, who was unfriendly to the United States. The Brazilian president fled, and the generals friendly to the U.S. seized power. U.S. officials weren't going to allow another Cuba to take root in South America then, and they likely aren't going to allow it today. In gunboat diplomacy, it isn't always about regime change. It can be for compliance. To negotiate a deal that involves oil sales to the United States instead of to China, or the removal of Russian and Iranian military infrastructure inside Venezuela. It's likely an attempt to get Latin American governments to take a stronger stance against drug cartels, which Maduro is already claiming to do with the deployment of 15,000 troops to the border with Colombia. Whatever the end goal is, the deployment follows a clear historical trend in the Americas. When the US is unable to overthrow a government like in Cuba, they instead turn to isolating that government economically until they're no longer perceived as a strategic threat. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Show notes, sources, and exclusive content is available on CappyArmy.com, where you can also get our newest merch, the GI Fuel t-shirt. Thank you for watching. Ending transmission now.
It's a medieval siege, something you'd expect in the Middle Ages. These were the words of UNICEF's Sheldon Yett, as reported in The Guardian, but while drawing comparisons with centuries past, they didn't refer to anything historic. No, Yett was talking about events happening today in 2025, about a city that has now spent over 500 days cut off from the outside world, surrounded by hostile forces that bombard its residential zones, refuse to allow in food or medicine, and kill, kidnap, or sexually assault those who try to escape. The Sudanese city known as El Fasher. The capital of the North Darfur region, El Fasher has been encircled since the spring of 2024 by the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary outfit that has now spent 2.5 years battling the Sudanese armed forces in a chaotic civil war. But while the overall conflict has been trending against the RSF since they lost control of Khartoum back in March, their hold on the country's western region of Darfur, a place nearly the size of Spain, has only grown stronger. Today, El Fasher is the last remaining Darfuri city not under the paramilitary's control, and even that is contested. RSF fighters have been moving deeper into central neighborhoods ever since establishing a foothold in the city's northeastern districts. While the SAF's 6th Division still maintains a presence, it is one that is shrinking. Middle East Eye recently quoted military sources saying the SAF control a mere 10 square kilometers around the airport. The Sudan War Monitor claims RSF fighters are within just a few hundred meters of the 6th Division's headquarters, separated in some places by only a minefield. Others report that the paramilitaries have made major advances in recent weeks. Now, this doesn't mean that those defending El Fasher are helpless. The SAF base is so fortified that it's unknown whether the RSF has the technical capacity to break through the perimeter. And the Joint Forces, a collection of Darfuri militias that have sided with the army despite historical enmity, are still able to mount a mobile defense, moving around the city at will. But these are mere crumbs of comfort beside the gigantic banquet of misery that is daily life in El Fasher, not least for the civilians who are trapped alongside the army. Depending on which source you read, the number of ordinary people still in El Fasher ranges anywhere from 260,000 to almost 750,000. Most are members of black African tribes like the Masalit, Fur, and Zaghawa that have been long persecuted by the nomadic Arab fighters who make up the core of the RSF. It was the paramilitary's forerunners, the Janjaweed, that carried out the Darfur genocide against these same people 2 decades ago. Some have been living in El Fasher ever since. Others came seeking refuge in late 2023 as the RSF swept across Darfur. Yet others only arrived earlier this year after the paramilitaries attacked and destroyed the giant Zamzam refugee camp that used to be located outside the city. What they all have in common is that they are imprisoned inside El Fasher. The UN reports that a single 50-meter wide exit remains under the control of RSF fighters, and while recent videos on social media have shown those fighters smiling and waving through civilians who want to leave, less propagandistic reports claim that the paramilitaries often execute men and boys who try to escape, while women and girls are liable to be sexually assaulted. Now, that's not to say that no one has ever escaped El Fasher. Hundreds of thousands have fled the city at various points in the siege, heading west to the refugee camp at Tawila. The issue is that the 65-kilometer journey to Tawila has become increasingly dangerous. When Zamzam fell, RSF fighters stalked the refugees along the road, killing at random. Others tried to escape through the desert, only to die of exposure. Here's how some aid workers in the region described the journey to Tawila to the New York Times. The road is lined with hastily dug graves and abandoned bodies. Is commonplace. Not that staying put in Al Fasher is a better option. Speaking to multiple outlets at the end of August, Nathaniel Raymond, director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale University, whose team has been monitoring the siege via satellite, described conditions this way, saying the suffering, quote, is unmatched anywhere in the world today except potentially Gaza. Remember, this is within the context of Sudan's wider civil war, a war that has displaced 12 million, pushed 25 million into extreme hunger, and seen whole cities sacked and burned. A war in which there are credible accusations of genocide in Darfur, and in which, according to former US Special Envoy for Sudan, Tom Perriello, the overall death toll may have already passed 400,000 people. So to say Al Fasher is experiencing unmatched levels of horror is a hell of a statement. Sadly, though, it may be right. Since last July, when famine was officially declared in Zamzam and other areas around the city, hunger and starvation have just become facts of life. 38% of all children under the age of 5 are thought to be acutely malnourished, with the last functioning hospital admitting up to 40 starving children a day. To quote the coverage in the Financial Times, aid workers said they had never witnessed conditions as bad. Now, that's not to say there's no food whatsoever. A handful of market stalls are still selling, but their prices are unaffordable for all but the very wealthiest. The Guardian reports a kilo of flour selling for the equivalent of $80 in a city where the average pre-war monthly salary was $70. And while 4 volunteer-run kitchens are still operating, offering one small meal a day, they've frequently been shelled, making visiting them dangerous. As a result, many in the city have been reduced to eating animal fodder just to stay alive. Speaking of shelling, the constant targeting of the city has added an extra layer of misery. Each day brings bombardments that start at dawn and continue through till night, usually targeting civilian areas and infrastructure. That one functioning hospital that we mentioned a moment ago, that's been bombed over 30 times, including a strike in January that killed 70 patients and staff. Other targets include homes and meeting places. In this case, the RSF aren't the only ones to blame. The SAF have also been accused of airstrikes on civilian districts, both in Al Fasher and across the wider war. In fact, indiscriminately bombing civilian areas is practically the SAF's signature move. But while the SAF are Islamist-aligned war criminals, the RSF is the only group that is both credibly accused of genocide and seems to have taken a sadistic delight in its crimes. Just look at the latest torture they've inflicted on Al Fasher, the distant buzz of drones. Supplied to the paramilitaries by the United Arab Emirates, drones have become a constant in the skies over Al Fasher. And while some are simply there for surveillance, others are used to randomly kill whoever catches the operator's eye. In mid-September, a drone strike on a mosque is thought to have killed around 80 people. To be clear, none of this is accidental, none of it is the result of careless aiming or mistaking civilian buildings for military installations. Rather, it all seems to be a part of a deliberate strategy by the RSF to wipe out Darfur's non-Arab communities. When the West Darfuri city of Al Janina fell in 2023, for example, the paramilitaries conducted house-to-house massacres that targeted members of the Masalit tribe, killing perhaps 15,000. When they stormed Zamzam, their fighters machine-gunned crowds of fleeing civilians. Amnesty International has documented RSF members keeping women in sexual slavery, while UNICEF has reported children as young as 1 being And look, we know, we can't believe we just said those words either, and yet the evidence is there for anyone who can stomach to sift through the reports. The evidence is that the RSF are trying to finish the genocide their forerunners in the Janjaweed began a generation ago, one which they're carrying out with a kind of theatrical cruelty. And all of that brings us to their latest prop, the earthen berms being constructed around Al Fasher. Running for 31 kilometers, these earth walls are beginning to encircle the city. Built by the RSF, they are intended to create what the Yale School of Public Health's Humanitarian Research Lab has dubbed, quote, a literal kill box. It's the HRL that alerted the world to their construction, watching via distant satellites as the civilians of Al Fasher were walled